Good evening and welcome to the fourth meeting of fiscal year 2024 for the Milton Planning Board. At this time, I would like to call our meeting to order and begin by introducing the members of the Planning Board and the staff. If you'd like to begin.
Jim Davis, member.
Sean Fahey, member.
Maggie Oldfields, member.
And Cheryl.
Cheryl Tagayas, member.
And Meredith Hall, serving as your chair. Now introductions of staff. Julia.
Julia Gutman, clerk.
Tim.
Tim Zerwinski, Director of Planning and Community Development.
And Josh.
Josh Eckertley, Assistant Director of Planning and Community Development.
Great, thank you, and good evening to all. I'd like to begin at this time. We're going to defer the minutes of August 3rd and the 10th. We have not, the edits haven't gone out, and that's fine, Cheryl. So I just was going to defer those to the next meeting. Can I have a motion to defer the minutes?
I'll make a motion to defer the minutes to the next upcoming meeting.
Okay.
Second.
Second, great, thank you. And we can't do roll call because Cheryl's on. So, Maggie.
Yes.
Sean.
Yes.
Yes.
Jim. Cheryl.
Yes. Excuse me. Yes.
And myself, yes. Thank you very much. Next, we can go on to our discussion of our next meeting dates. We have two dates upcoming. We have a September 14th meeting scheduled, and we also have a September 28th meeting, our regular scheduled dates on those. And do we have a date set for the forum, MBTA forum? Tim, on?
We don't. I've been out this week with COVID, so a couple of things have kind of fallen to the back burner a little bit. But we will get a venue for. What do we usually do? It's usually the third week of the month, but we'll have it on the regular monthly schedule and get that publicized for everybody.
Okay, that's great. Thank you very much. So next item on the agenda is staff update. Tim?
Not a lot that we want to already be discussing on the agenda, but I just wanted to use this venue just to make sure people are aware of the news that came out this morning out of the MBTA Board of Directors meeting. So they're going to be doing a closure of the Ashmont branch and the Mattapan line for 2 weeks in October, from October 14th to October 29th. Similar to the closure that they did at the Orange Line last year, the difference being we've got more than 2 weeks notice, which they didn't have the last time. So they're announcing shuttle buses that are going to divert service off of the Mattapan line and the Ashmont line. I know that the city of Boston is going to be working with the T over the next month and a half to try to come up with some other alternatives, for people that are served by those lines. This just came out today, so as we get more information, we'll publicize it through, the usual town channels on the town website and social media. But keep an eye on that. One thing that we'll obviously want to, be hearing from the T about, and we'll reach out to them as soon as they get back to the office, is kind of what the nature of the repairs on the Mattapan line are going to be. If you've been on the Ashmont line recently, you know how slow it is. Those slow zones are the result of, track work that kind of needs to be done. You can't drive the train fast enough, or else there'll be damage to the tracks. And so, they're trying to get this all done in one swoop. I have not been aware of any of these slow zones on the Mattapan line, although I wouldn't be surprised if there are. So we'll just want to get a better idea of what the nature of that work is going to be, and if and how it has any relation to the transformation project. But, more information on that as it comes. So we'll keep you all posted.
Tim, this is Sean. I'm sorry to hear you have COVID. I hope you feel better quickly. And thank you for not attending the meeting since you have COVID. Did they say that they're going to close the entire line from Ashmont to Mattapan? Is that what they're closing?
Yeah, the whole line, and then from Ashmont to JFK.
Ashmont to JFK. Okay.
Yep.
All right, great. Thanks for that, Cliff.
Another brief update from us is that the physical copies and binders of the newly refiled 111 Highland Street project that you all gave that approval for the other meeting are available in the planning board office. So if you want a hard copy of all those refiled documents, those are available for pickup either after this meeting, they're up on Julia's desk, or in the coming weeks.
Julia has it on the table, I think.
They're here.
Oh, brilliant. Thanks, Julia.
Yes.
Yeah, and we'll be scheduling that public hearing for the September 14th meeting, as well as the Bent's public hearing, which we talked about during staff update at the last meeting as well.
Great. And Josh, I just wanted to hear, you sent over on August 14th to the DPW the letter that we approved, and the deadline was Monday?
Yeah, so that's correct. It was sent on the 14th, was sent to the printers earlier this week, and is set to be included in the September, October, and November tranches of the water bill.
Okay, September, October.
Quick question, Josh. Do you know if we could edit that if we wanted to for the next two water bills?
Yeah, you can't edit for the September. There's obviously, and we have another couple of weeks before the October and November ones go out, so there's an opportunity to edit that as well, if you want to go through that process again.
Thank you very much. Is that it, Tim?
Yes.
Tim, this is Sean. I have a request I'd like to make of you, and obviously when you're healthy. My request is for you to return back to the meetings. And my reasoning is this. I think this particular topic that we have, all of us have, you and Josh have it, and we have it, the MBTA communities, it's likely the most challenging issue that you could face in your entire career, in Milton. And I feel that you are the Director of Planning and Community Development. It's absolutely a leadership role, and I feel that together as a group, we'll work better in person. I think we've stretched out, virtual meetings as, pretty substantially, and I think there's an awful lot of value with your expertise and your knowledge to be at the table with us.
Does the board feel that way?
I do, yes.
Yes.
I think communication is really important at this time. Sometimes things, lack of information can occur, and I just think it is. Obviously there's exceptions if you're, away or traveling or, different life situations. We all have had those experiences, but to have you consistently not in attendance, I think is seeming to be a little problematic. So it would be great. When you feel better, obviously, when you feel much better.
Yeah, understood. And Sean, I hear your comments. I mean, I've been availing myself of being able to participate remotely. The planning board is not the only board and committee that I staff. And especially over the course of the past couple of years, I have had a tremendous number of evening meetings beyond the planning board. And the only thing that has given me a semblance of work-life balance is the ability to participate remotely. So, there is a trade-off there. I think that, but I do understand where the board's coming from. I will, I'll talk to the town administrator about this. I just want to make sure that, my workload is manageable. And I'm able to make and keep the commitments that I have to, again, the other boards and committees that I work with, and also, to my day job and to my family. But I take the request seriously, and we'll probably see you guys in a couple weeks in the Blue Room.
Great.
Yeah, Tim, I appreciate all the pressure you have and trying to balance everything, and certainly, a home life too. I think it's critically important to everybody. But I think it's not just the planning board. I feel the residents of the town. There's an awful lot at stake for the residents, and we have an extremely short period of time, to deal with this particular issue. So I'm not saying my request is a forever request. I'm saying that given the nature of what we're dealing with and the serious matter that it is. So whatever you can do, I would appreciate it, and I'm sure the residents of the town will appreciate it as well. Thank you for considering.
You got it.
Thank you. So we can now move at this time to our citizens speak. If there's anyone on Zoom that would like to speak on any issues, and if there's anything on our agenda that you will have time to speak if you would like, also the public. But are we seeing any hands up?
Cheryl's got her hand up.
Cheryl? Yeah.
Yeah, sorry, I meant to chime in just a little bit on that last topic, if I may.
Yeah.
I was going to make a request that, with that request to have Tim attend our meetings in person, that we could go back to setting a time limit or at least having a vote to extend the duration of the meeting so that we're not having requesting staff to be in the building with us until nearly midnight during our meeting. So if we could be disciplined and try and end our meetings no later than 10, I think that would be helpful with that request to have staff to attend in person.
I think that's a great suggestion, because Julia certainly has been here on many nights, so.
I'd support that too, Cheryl. I think it's a great idea.
I thought you might, Sean.
Yeah, it may. I know you
Okay,
did.
great. Thank you.
Yep, good. Okay.
Just a note, a few years ago, there was a request by Alex Whiteside that the board took a vote on to take a vote when 10 o'clock was approaching and to see if the board was open to ending the meeting or extending it before 10.
Great. I think that's
So,
great.
Great.
Yeah.
We'll make it a practice.
Great procedure,
Yeah.
absolutely.
Yep. Thanks, Julia.
Okay, so do we have any other hands up? We have.
We have Donna Dickerson.
Great.
I actually
We can.
do not seem to have the ability to give her the ability to talk. Josh, do you have hosting capabilities?
No, it's the webinar host, but they've just made you a co-host, and if you can also make me one, that'll be helpful too. For
Okay.
admin.
Donna, if you give your name and address for the record.
Hi, can you hear me?
Welcome. Yes, welcome, Donna.
Good evening, members of the Planning Board, the Planning Department, any select board members who are tuned in, and fellow citizens. I'm Donna Dickerson, a resident of Capon Street. I moved to this verdant trolley neighborhood in the 80s and commuted on the trolley daily to Cambridge for over 30 years. I have long been in favor of multifamily housing in Milton, and I have felt that the MBTA zoning initiative is a golden opportunity to diversify and increase Milton's housing stock for residents of varied income levels. I am alarmed by the option 1 plan voted on by the select board on Tuesday night for recommendation to the planning board. I'm especially concerned by the arbitrarily limited area of the transit area triplex within the eligible transit zone. This was a feature of option 2 as well. For me, equitable rezoning should involve the area of the entire half-mile wide zone, excluding historic properties, of course, plus areas in other parts of town. I have yet to hear a satisfying explanation about why larger lots should be excluded from the transit zone and why lot sizes as small as 5,500 square feet should be considered appropriate for development of multifamily housing in Milton. Why the microfocus on the limited 1/4 mile wide area? This is a larger issue than cramming numbers to fit a compliance model. The principle of the preservation of the character of a neighborhood applies to property owners with smaller lots as well as to those with larger lots. A 5,500 square foot lot with a 3-unit structure and 3 off-street parking spaces with inadequate green space will alter the Elliott Street neighborhood in ways that current residents will not find acceptable. When I moved here from Dorchester, I was looking for access to public transportation within a green neighborhood. I value my small yard and garden as much as anyone else in Milton values theirs. I urge town officials to nix the transit area triplex of options 1 and 2, should it be considered, and include a much broader area of lots throughout the half-mile wide transit zone. Allow the possibility of the development of well and sensitively designed multifamily housing on lots of 7,500 square feet and larger. I also ask that transportation planning for the expansion of Milton's bus infrastructure become an integral part of strategic planning in town. More buses will be needed as apartments, condos, and houses are built around town. This planning is necessary to fulfill the ideal of transit-oriented development. One more thing, please devote much more time on the planning board's meeting agendas and indeed schedule special meetings as needed to hammer out appropriate and thoughtful zoning language to meet the compliance deadline. Time is a-wasting. Thank you.
Thank you, Donna. Who do we have next?
We have Pete Jackson next.
Okay.
Pete, if you give
we
your
can-
name and address for the record.
Peter Jackson, 14 Capon Street. You hear me?
Yes, welcome, Pete.
Okay.
Yes.
Good evening. I attended Tuesday night's select board meeting. I was concerned about items on the agenda for the select board to discuss and approve compliance and districts and density for the MBTA community initiative. I voiced my concern during Citizens Speak. As you know, I support the MBTA communities as a valuable tool for providing more and a broader array of housing opportunities in town. I listened to the planning department's presentation of totally new material and to the select board discussion and approval of these items. I was shocked. I wrote a letter to the select board and copied you. It didn't take long, and I was corrected and informed that the select board votes were not approving or dictating anything, only providing feedback to the planning board on the schemes they hadn't seen yet. The transit area triplex is unthinkably bad zoning. 5,500 square feet lots with three stories as of right and 3 off-street parking spaces almost dictates flat-roofed 3-family homes like those so common in many Boston neighborhoods with very little green space. This style of housing is not appropriate for Milton. If we want to preserve neighborhood character and offer the quality of life Milton is known for. Instead of compressing the district size and reducing lot sizes, the planning board should study expanding the area to encompass enough 7,500 square foot lots to accommodate the required number of multifamily housing units. Bigger lot sizes provide greater design flexibility. Thank you.
Thank you, Pete. Do we have 2 more? I think?
We have Jim Coyle next. Jim, if you can give us your name and address for the record.
Yeah, good evening. My name is Jim Coyle. I live on Bunton Street, and at a recent meeting, I raised a question about the heavy-duty cable work being done by Verizon in East Milton and probably other parts of Milton, as well as nearby Quincy. And the next day, a truck ran into some wires, knocked down my neighbor's, cables to their home. I'm giving an example. I'm involved in a lot of construction work in various towns in the state here, but Quincy has a requirement for new projects of any kind. All utilities are underground, basically. New developments of any kind or redevelopments. And I've seen several instances of that in the last couple of years where it's all underground. And it's part of the, what rules they're following exactly, but it is expected. And the unsightliness of all this patchwork on existing telephone poles with putting a little short piece on there and hanging wires of all different kinds out in the middle of the street, lower and lower. Some of them are blocking the view of traffic lights, so, partially, not a full obstruction, but on Willard Street, for example, and there's just other areas too, same thing. If the project goes ahead here of more housing, I'm certainly in favor of that, but I like what the previous speaker said about having larger lots spread over a less dense, make them less dense too. And my second point here is about public safety. East Milton, where I live, we have an influx of young families moving out of Boston with expanding families. Every day I look out the window, there's young mothers pushing strollers around. The sidewalks are somewhat unusable in many parts of East Milton. They're too narrow, unsafe. And this MBTA project that is about to happen here needs to have adequate, maybe even better than adequate, public safety reviews built into the whole process. And I think that's essential, or it just shouldn't go ahead at all. Today I was on Adams Street, people park at Dunkin' Donuts, they walk across the road, sometimes they look, sometimes they don't. We had somebody killed by a bus a couple of years ago here, right in front of Starbucks. I mean, all this public safety stuff needs to be part and parcel of everything the planning board is doing, and it absolutely should not be rushed through without proper public safety reviews by the professionals. A little bit related to that, it was in the 40B projects, basically those projects can get away with their safety reviews incomplete. I'll give one example of that. The very last meeting of the 40B project on Franklin and Bassett, I was the last speaker in the last public session. The traffic consultant was there, and they admitted that the flow of delivery vehicles, Amazon, FedEx, UPS, the post office, furniture is constant, and all the small, narrow streets of East Milton, and probably other towns as well. It was not even required by the zoning board to demand a thorough review of the delivery traffic in East Milton. It just wasn't done. And their consultant readily admitted that. It needs to be a part of any development, what it is here now. And I mean, maybe other towns or cities have faced this already. I think, and there's probably ideas that can be learned from our surrounding neighborhood, in Quincy in particular. And I'd like to see that I know
Absolutely, Jim.
You're already very busy, but consult with the surrounding towns, please.
Great.
See what you learn from each other. Maybe you're doing that already and I just I'm unaware of it. Anyway, that's it.
Terrific, Jim. Thank you very much for those comments. And next we have
Next, we have Diane DiTullio Agostino. Diane, if you can give us your name and and address for the record.
Diane DiTullio Agostino, Precinct 9 Town Meeting Member, former Selectman, current Chair of the Commission on Disability, and I'll stop at that so you can expedite your meeting. That I greatly appreciate that you have a Citizen Speak section. I am calling regarding the activities of the past week, and I would absolutely let you know that the residents that I hear from do want to see this planning board. We're glad that you're meeting in person. If someone's sick, that's great. And the town had been through some changes with the planning director, who I greatly appreciate all the help he has provided to you as well as to myself over his shorter term here in Milton. However, this is a critical issue, the MBTA issue. The majority of residents, it's summertime, a lot of people are away. And yet the other night, we saw the Board of Selectmen basically usurp or supersede the planning board. So I went back and pulled out a few laws regarding the charge of the planning board. Once, years ago, when there was no planning board, the Board of Selectmen would act as the planning board. And there were other entities, it's under Mass General Law, Chapter 41, Section 81B, which once you were all voted into office under this chapter and verse, then the powers and duties of the prior individuals cease to exist. So I understand why residents were shocked to see a Board of Selectmen whose primary obligation to the town is fiduciary. What is the financial impact of any action that the town takes? To see them take a vote on a zoning issue, which is under the jurisdiction of this board that's meeting tonight. I want to raise that point because an analysis, when you do an economic analysis, you have to look at all the factors that are going to impact the cost. The amount of multifamily units, and I'm not either for or against because the homework hasn't been done. And that's something that I always feel people need to do before making any financial decision. And this is a financial decision. This is not affordable housing. Some individuals in town think that this is going to increase affordable housing. We're not talking about affordable housing. We currently have 9,844 houses in the town, and yet we're talking about adding, and it's not that each one of these 2,461 would be an addition to that 9,000, but that's a minimum number of multifamily units, if I understand correctly what has been shared with me. So if we even just look at the biggest expense in our budget, the schools, we currently, from those houses, and these units, multifamily, are supposed to be for children also, and including children. We have 4,321 students just from the housing we currently have. If you add a minimum, which some units can be already in existence, you're going to substantially increase, possibly by thousands, the number of children in our schools. What will be the financial impact? You're going to increase the demand on public safety. Take your warrant as the planning board and literally take every department in the town to look at what adding this many units or more to the community will do. Not to speak of, my primary concern in Milton is safety. I can't even fathom. The intent is it would be near a rapid transit, and we heard, a lot of people who live near the trolley do get to Boston using the transit system we have. But the busing system from some parts of town, because it's supposed to be 50% near the transit and then 50% elsewhere in town, I believe, the busing system is deplorable. You cannot depend on taking a bus to get to the zoning. I literally request that the financial review be done of the impact, the potential impact, looking at a minimum number of additional items being added versus potentially a lot more than that. With just 28,630 residents currently, we potentially, looking at the numbers, could have 1,000 more students. How many more schools would that require, buildings would that require? And also, your jurisdiction, along with, I do understand, or at least I've been told recently, that the town planner actually works for the Board of Selectmen. However, it is the planning board that has the jurisdiction and the requirement that any zoning changes in the town of Milton, there's public hearings. So well, there might have been some discussions and there was a short poll put out there. There is a lot of unknowns in your decision making. And the biggest and last point I do want to make is on this new law, Mass General Law, Chapter 40A, Section 3A, if you have it in front of you. It points out Section 3A, A1, an MBTA community shall have a zoning ordinance, and then it goes on. I don't understand how this law, right after an MBTA community, does not put the Mass General Law that defines an MBTA community. It's not defined, which would seem to make it deficient if it's not defined. You have your regulations, but those are not laws, those are regulations. You also have some January 29th, 2021 explanation. It's just a preliminary guidance on what an MBTA community is, but the law has to define what an MBTA community is right after those three words. Otherwise, you're making a lot of assumptions that could seriously impact the community, both financially as well as safety-wise. When we just voted and are spending all this money on new fire buildings and firehouse stations, and yet will those meet the needs of this additional increase of units? So I know you've got a lot of work ahead of you. I commend you for doing your work, and I hope that you'll get the actual job of what the select board's charge is to look at the fiduciary obligation and what impact it would have, as well as this zoning question. And I really appreciate the work that this planning board is doing, and your charge that you have all accepted and been sworn into office to take. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Anyone else? Any other hands? Okay.
No more hands.
No more hands. Okay, great. So with that, we can move to our new business and Wolcott Woods Special Permit, determination of minor amendment for change to retaining wall. Is Jack Dolly with us tonight, or?
I just asked to promote him to panelist, so it may be a moment before he joins us.
Terrific.
Jack, you're with us. I'll let you, if it's all right with the chair, just go ahead and describe your project.
Great. Yes. Welcome, Jack.
Yes. Hey, all. FYI, I am down on the Cape in the kitchen with people walking around, so if there's clanking around, sorry about that. You're familiar with a project that my firm and I are doing called Wolcott Woods off of Canton Ave, for which we received a special permit from the planning board some time ago. One of the conditions of the permit deals with walls, retaining walls. And there are a number of provisions in there as to what type of walls and their composition can go where. We've encountered in building the last section of roadway in the upper left corner of the site, if you were standing on site on Canton Ave looking up, we have a cut, which we always knew there was going to be a road cut up in there. That goes from, maybe a foot to 8 or 9 feet down to back down to a foot. And we have a lot of groundwater. We've had a lot of groundwater on the site as it is. It comes off of the Blue Hill, both surface and subsurface, that we've been managing as we have opened up the site. In this location, a wall was proposed in the original permit. The engineer and the contractor are suggesting that we do an engineered block wall as opposed to a masonry wall due to a concern about hydrostatic pressure, which is basically water pressure behind the wall. And use one of the products that was permitted in allowed product that was permitted in the special permit, a chiseled concrete block material in this section, which really has an engineering design behind it, how it's installed, how it's anchored back into the slope, how drainage is dealt with behind it, below it, etc. This is not a cost issue. This is a design issue. And we've used these, they're called various things. We call them elephant blocks. People call them Lego blocks. They're a concrete block that's about 3 feet long, 18 inches tall, and they're preformed, if you will, so that they can anchor to each other. They're laid in courses. In the highest condition, we would probably have 4 to 5 courses, and then we would slope them back down. I've used them extensively on other projects successfully. We've planted both above, quite successfully above, landscape material that tends to grow out and fall over the face of the rock over time. I think I provided some pictures from one of my projects in that instance. We've also planted in front of. So we're asking the board for an insubstantial amendment to the permit to allow the use of this permitted product in this particular location.
Great, thank you. Yes, Sean, if you want to start.
Yeah, Jack, I just have one question. I saw the photos that you sent. They're very helpful. Thank you for that. The growth that appears to have covered the face of the stone wall in one of your other developments really hides the wall in its entirety, as I see it in the picture. Is that correct?
That is correct. Yep.
Yeah. How long, Jack, does that growth take to
Probably 3 years.
Okay.
I'm sorry, I don't know your first name.
My first name's Sean.
Sean, I'm sorry, we haven't met. That is about a 3-year cycle.
Okay. And also the wall, you had another photo of the wall darkening in color, probably a weathering process is what gets it to that look. How long did that take, that weathered look?
A year.
Okay. Yeah,
we have water that comes down over the face of it, and then it also bleeds through the joints, if you will, and it's basically traveling with organics, and in part what you're looking at is essentially mold.
Yeah.
There is a product that we try to bring to the table in this instance that where the product would be painted, believe it or not, in different hues, and that manufacturer has discontinued the provision of that product, unfortunately. So, we could manufacture that shading instantly with that other product, but you can't get it. So, I think I said in my letter transparently that when it first goes in, it's raw. It's like anything. It looks a little stark, admittedly. But I also have the experience that over time, it settles into the site quite well, in my opinion. The other thing is it is on the opposite side of the road from the units. You've seen some of our work out there. There's quite a bit of masonry, not masonry, but stone masonry walls that we use as both retaining and landscape features. And, we're not proposing to substitute, this product around the units where, those retaining and or landscape features really add to the character of the homes and the appearance of it. It's on the
Jack, I actually have no issue with it. I asked just because I was, for those that may wonder how long it's going to take to get there. That was the reason for my question. And I'm not suggesting that anything should be done to enhance that look. And lastly, I'd rather have a wall that can handle the hydrostatic pressure than putting in a wall that's going to be subject to the issues that would result from that down the road. So I have no further questions. I think it's a good solution.
Thank you, sir.
Maggie, yeah.
Oh, hi. So I'm Maggie, and
My question, I have a couple things, is how many, or who will be seeing the wall? Will the residents be seeing it? Will be the residents of the community, residents driving down Canton Ave, or the hikers in the Blue Hills?
Good question, Maggie. Nice to meet you. You will not see it from Canton Ave. It's not, it's way up in the site, 1,000+ feet off of Canton Ave in the upper left corner. So, as a general resident of Milton, you'd have to drive into the site and drive, if you will, what we call the loop to experience it. The immediate residents, there are, excuse me, let me think out loud. There's 6 buildings, 6 duplexes. So there are 12 homes in this corner, phase, area, whatever we want to use. They will be the immediate consumers, if you will, visually of seeing it. From a hiker in the Blue Hills, you'd have to really come out of the Blue Hills into my development and walk through the development to encounter it. So, which is allowed. Right. Admittedly, we have a trailhead provision at the top of the road. I don't know how likely it is, to be honest, but that's the best I can answer it, Maggie.
Yeah. So, as we all know, this is a historic site, and I think we need to be respectful of the site. So I'm wondering if your civil engineer would have any objections to build a reinforced concrete wall on a reinforced concrete spread footing with a dry face stone veneer.
We posed that question. The concern we have is, at its tallest piece, as much as we can put a spread fitting and anchor the vertical component with rebar, our experience is that over time that pressure is real. The freeze thaw and the water, that wall is going to over time tilt toward the road. Even with, we'll put weep holes and things like that. Ultimately, it is going to, bend, in the will of pressure. So, the decision to come before you wasn't lightly made because, I took this project through quite an extensive process. The decision was made to use an engineered solution that is proven and that, has an anchoring technology associated with design of the product, and then dress it up, if you will, with over time with weathering and with the landscape plant material that is shown in the picture. So if your ask is for me to go back and consider that, my response is that I will not.
You don't want to, okay? Because I believe aesthetics is everything, and especially in this project, it's a beautiful site. You've done a great job. It was a big change to the existing landscape there. So I'm also wondering, have you talked to the residents up there, and have you received their input on it?
Well, I have communicated, as is required by the special permit, that I would be that I've made this request of the planning board. That is the immediate neighborhood. We have a neighborhood list, and you may or may not be familiar that that they were actively involved during the rezoning and the permitting process, and that there is an obligation to provide project updates periodically. So I made that disclosure. I did not get a single comment back about it. I did get several comments back. Thank you for the update. Glad to hear it's going well, things of that nature. I have not, Maggie, polled my clients, if that's your question, what their opinion is. Frankly, that's not their purview.
Cheryl has her hand up, but did you have something else?
Yeah, so the only, my concern is, are we going to be setting a precedent for other builders to use this stone wall? So I know we have, we have other stone walls that have been built around town, you know, up off Woodland. They've used real stone as a veneer. Down by me on Ford Ranch Road on their bridge, we have the memory care coming up. So my fear is we're going to be setting a precedent of this type of block. I usually prefer a look that's a little bit more natural. My concern is in your pictures you use a lot of creeping juniper. Creeping juniper, you look like you had a smaller size creeping juniper, probably was like a 2 or 3 gallon at time of planting. The problem with creeping juniper was when they start growing into each other, they actually don't like to touch and they start browning out and they start dying off. I know a lot of contractors like to use blue-red creeping juniper because they're fairly inexpensive, but it's not kind of one of my favorite plants to use. So it might be, if you don't want to change the look of the wall, would you be interested in planting on the bottom of the wall so it grows up faster than the juniper would be climbing down? Because as they say in plant world, the first year plants sleep, and then second year they creep, and then the third year they start to leap. So it's a minimum of a 3-year investment of time. And also, if you were going to do plant material, it would probably be a requirement of I would think a 5 or 7 gallon. But I prefer a natural look.
Do you have a recommendation for what you would plant in an upward climbing?
Boston ivy?
No, and that's why I think you've done such a great job at the site, and I know you have a lot of water issues up there, and I think you've had a lot of washout up there. So that's just
a challenging site.
Yeah, it's a challenging site. You have deer, junipers or deer food. So yeah, I didn't look at the landscape plan, so I'm not sure.
Okay, let's go to Cheryl next. Cheryl.
Yes, hi. Tim or Josh, could you pull up the memo that was supplied to us regarding this?
Just pulling it up now.
Thank you. And can you increase the size of that? And I wanted to, the language there, 13 walls, is taken from the special permit, correct?
Yes.
And so that last sentence, all retaining walls for whatever purpose may be of concrete or other structural materials, but shall be faced with natural stone in compliance with the bylaw. So that's referring to the zoning bylaw. So I don't see how we can approve something that's different than what the zoning bylaw requires, at least without it being considered a more significant change than a minor change. I recall this discussion about these materials and these walls. I understand the concern about the water, but concrete is used commonly in retaining walls where there's hydrostatic pressure as well. Concrete's used in submersive environments. And so the detailing and engineering of it, however, in my experience, is not by the civil engineer, it's by a structural engineer when it gets to be a certain height. And so my question for you, Jack, is whether you've spoken to a structural engineer about this wall, and then also a geotechnical engineer who, in my experience, again, would be the one who would tell or advise you of how to direct the water or manage the water on the other side of that concrete.
I have not.
I would ask for Tim, if you've got the zoning bylaw that refers to the, or Josh, to that this special permit is referring to with respect to stone walls. That zoning was, as Maggie and Jackie both have mentioned, there was a lot of work done in developing that zoning bylaw with a lot of folks in the neighborhood as well as the planning board and so forth. And this discussion of what these materials would be in these walls was important. And I do understand that the use of the walls, we were interested in a balanced cut and fill, or as little cut and fill as possible. That's kind of difficult, but when you're also trying to balance saving trees. And so I do understand the need for the wall. I just would maybe request to dig a little deeper in terms of what your options are. And then I think we need to look at the bylaw itself and be clear what we can and can't approve with some kind of a change.
Great.
Jack, Meredith, I'm sorry. Jack, what's the length of this condition? How many lineal feet?
Jack, you're muted.
I'm going to guess, Sean. I don't have the papers here in front of me. I'm guessing it's, something of order of magnitude 75 to 80 feet.
Okay. And is the face of exposure consistent? Same height of exposed wall over that entire distance?
No, we said it right.
That's our goal, Sean. The thought is that we could do 3 courses and then slope, at a 2-to-1 slope back up into the woods. Cheryl will appreciate this. There's what has been referred to as an alley of trees that were planted, God knows when, long time ago. We could drop that slope to a 3-to-1, but we'd get into the roots of these trees, and really, we'd probably kill them. While there's nothing particular special about the trees, they're there. They're historic. They were put in. They're big. They create that vegetative buffer between us and the Blue Hills that we try hard to try to maintain. So the notion is that we use 3 courses, steeply slope, back up, in a stable way, plant that slope with junipers, as Maggie said, or some ground control. Cheryl, I'm not going to bend myself into a pretzel over this. This is the right solution. I wouldn't, our work well enough to know that I wouldn't be, investing the time to be here if I didn't firmly believe that it was the right solution. And if it's not going to be supported, we'll do something else.
So I have the zoning language. Let me just I'll share my screen real quick. I'm cheating. I'm using the recodified version, but we all know that the language is exactly the same. There shall be adequate, safe, and convenient arrangement of walkways, paths, driveways, and parking areas, and suitable lighting. Varied construction materials such as brick or stone shall be used when feasible and appropriate to site design. All retaining walls shall be stone-faced. I think that's the reference in the special permit to the bylaw.
And Tim, is there any language there? We sometimes have language which allows the planning board to waive a particular requirement. Does that language exist in this section?
Give me a minute.
So if you, while you look that up, Tim, if, Jack, if you think this is the right solution, would you be amenable to doing a veneer on it to make it fit in better with the historic nature of the landscape?
You're muted, Jack.
No.
So so I understand the issue. I mean, this is obviously, you want a stabilized situation here, but I think it's worth just an ask to a structural engineer to take a look at that and just see if we can do something and keep what is in the bylaw if possible. And just get an answer before we make a final decision.
I thank you for the comment. I'm not going to do that. I want to finish this road, and if we don't have a license to proceed as requested tonight, I'm not going to go through another month or 6 weeks of process here and keep my road, basically held in abeyance until the next piece of work we have to put in is the wall. We want to get that road paved as we're, as we know, we found a little bit of water this summer every Friday. Unfortunately, it doesn't come in sprinkles. And getting this stabilized and getting it put to bed here in the next 30 or 45 days is critical for us. And again, if we're not going to proceed with this as requested, then we'll put a wall up that is compliant, but I don't think it's ultimately not going to be the right solution, nor do I think it'll be the right aesthetic, but that's my opinion. I know a little bit about my business here, guys. In fact, I know a lot about my business. So my responses are firm because I know my business.
Right. So our next meeting is on the 14th. You don't think you could still get an answer before then and we could approve it, knowing that we have that piece of information?
What's the question that I am chasing?
Meeting with a civil engineer to see about doing structurally a concrete wall that could be faced with stone. We do have quite a few in town in Milton.
I'll ask the question tomorrow, and I'll either elect to withdraw the request or come back on the 14th.
Okay, that sounds good. I just don't
most
want to hold
likely
you up at all. Yeah.
Yeah, just to be clear, most likely I'll be withdrawing the request.
Okay. All right.
I'm not interested in playing around here, guys. I'm sorry.
Yeah. No.
Again, I'm very confident in what I do. I'm very confident in the product that we put out in the marketplace and what we deliver and our work product more than speaks for itself. So
great. All right. So that's great. So you'll make that call tomorrow, and then but we will be available. We would be happy to have you on the 14th and approve it one way or the other for you.
Well, approve it or deny it on the 14th.
Or deny it. Yeah.
Yeah. Those are the two choices. Okay. Nice to see you all. Thank you for the time.
Thank you.
Okay.
It's a beautiful project. Cheryl, you had your hand up. Sorry. Did you?
Yeah, I did. I don't want to lose sight of the zoning question that I asked because I think it's really germane to the request and the decision that we can make here. So I think it would be beneficial if we could get a staff memo, at least outlining what the proper course would be if in fact there is no provision to waive a design standard when it's in the zoning. The special permits are written and so that the projects as applied for are compliant with the zoning. And typically, if there's a problem with the zoning, there are attempts to make changes to the zoning, but we can't just waive requirements in the zoning. So I just would like to be really clear about what position we can be in here.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, I was giving it a quick look. I didn't see any provision in the zoning for the planning board to waive any element of the zoning. I'll give it a closer look. I don't know if it warrants a memo necessarily, is just as much as just a message to the board, outlining, that review. But we'll give it a closer look tomorrow and get some clarity on that.
Great.
Yeah, Tim, that would be helpful. And moving forward, it would be helpful to us if we had that information. I know at one point you created a spreadsheet, with the fruit center, and you let us know in that spreadsheet what was in the bylaw, what was in the special permit. So that might be helpful to produce something like that.
Great. Okay, so if there's not anything else on that, we can move to our old business, which is the discussion of the MBTA communities update. We do have two people who are going to be consultants who are going to be joining them this evening. But I just wanted to, before we begin, just have a brief discussion on what happened on Tuesday evening at the select board meeting. And I'm going to hold off my comments, but I would like to hear from the other board members, and then of course our town planner.
Well, if I could, I definitely have some questions, and I think I have some comments as well. And I guess my first question is for Tim. So we have 3 consultants that we've hired that are still working to complete the tasks that they've been assigned. And I guess my question, Tim, is how important is the information that they're preparing for us? And how important is that we have that information?
So we have, and I apologize, Meredith. I didn't know. I thought we were going to go straight to our consultants. I promoted Eric from RKG, so he's in our panelist group. But Eric, you can just sit tight for a minute.
We'll get to it as soon as possible.
So we have RKG Associates working on a fiscal impact analysis. This is a priority for the planning board. So, Sean, not to turn it around on you, but it's a question for the board as to how important is that information for your decision-making purposes, and in terms of how you move forward either with or without a final report on that fiscal impact analysis.
Okay.
So we were. Oh, sorry.
Go ahead. I'm sorry. I thought you were turning it back to me. I'm listening.
So we worked with MAPC briefly on just a simple kind of quick compliance model run of some sub-districts. So our kind of working relationship with MAPC was a little bit of a one-off. And then we're also working with UTIL. We're working with UTIL, again, on technical assistance, on working with the compliance model to determine zoning district boundaries and zoning parameters for those zoning sub-districts. So they've been testing different sub-districts, different locations, different sizes of those sub-districts, different zoning parameters of those sub-districts. We have them through a contract with, through a grant from Mass Housing Partnership. We are going to be bringing them on board on a longer term basis, hopefully through the end of this process, through some additional state grant money that we have. So they'll be with us, fulfilling that role. So it's not, Sean, it's not necessarily, their work is ongoing as the board's work and the town's work is ongoing. When we need to test something in the compliance model, when we need to adjust district boundaries, when we need to adjust dimensional parameters, they're the ones that help us do that.
Yep. So I have a basic question. Tonight we're looking forward to hearing from RKG and UTIL. And my question for you is, would you advise the planning board to make decisions and vote tonight before we hear from these consultants?
I can't answer that, Sean.
Why not?
Sean, this seems like a little bit of a gotcha question, so I'm actually not going to answer that.
Tim, it's not a gotcha question. It's a very sincere question. Obviously, the select board voted on Tuesday night before the planning board had taken any vote or had even completed our work. And I'm wondering what advice you would give to the select board before Tuesday night's meeting.
So the select board got a version of the presentation that UTIL is going to give to you tonight. We had a meeting with UTIL on Monday. I had their information and their slides and their diagrams. I presented that to the select board at the select board's request, and they took the actions that they take based on that information. So they heard the presentation and then they took a vote. So I would anticipate that that's something that the planning board would do or choose not to do. So
you know how difficult this task is. It's difficult for you, it's difficult for Josh, it's difficult for us. And my question is there a reason that you wouldn't have advised the select board to wait until the consultants had provided their finished work?
I can't speak for the select board.
That's not my question. Is there a reason that you wouldn't have advised them to wait?
Sean, they're getting the same information. The fiscal impact analysis is a project that the planning board is engaged in, and so that's something that I'm sure they're interested in, but that's not something that originated with them. They are here. They heard more or less the same information about the proposed sub-districts that UTIL has been working on Tuesday. There may be slight updates based on work that they've done in the last 2 days, but the information is the same. The presentation is largely the same.
Yeah, I guess we're probably not going to get to a conclusion in this exchange between you and I. They voted without any information from RKG. There's been no fiscal analysis provided yet by RKG, yet a vote took place without understanding what those fiscal implications are for the town.
Well, Sean, I think that the position that the select board has taken is that we have to pass zoning. And so while it's important to understand what the fiscal impacts are going to be, that's not a driver of the decision to comply or not. We have to comply. That's the position that they've taken.
Well, as a speaker said earlier, and I share a similar opinion, the select board is responsible for the fiscal business of the town. And back on the 25th of January, I had sent to the select board and to the town administrator an analysis that was done of a potential financial impact to the town. I sent it to you, Tim, the following day. I had a resident that was willing to do some work to prepare a draft of a potential fiscal analysis, because I do feel we have a responsibility to the residents of the town to understand if we ever were to have 2,461 units in the town, what potentially could be the impact of that. So a resident of the town who's very well respected had done some legwork using readily available data, using our warrant from '23, and had prepared this. And you probably have seen it, Tim. It was in your email. And again, this was back on the 25th of January. It did reflect an annual deficit of almost $11 million. My email that I wrote to the select board that night, and this is for the benefit of the residents. I'd like them to understand this. And here's what I wrote to the select board and our town administrator. As I mentioned last night in the select board meeting, because I had spoken in the select board meeting before I had sent this, I am speaking as a resident of Milton and a taxpayer. I have a very strong concern for the potential cost implications of adopting the MBTA Communities Act and the resulting impact to our costs and annual budget. The attached worksheet has been prepared using readily available data. While there are interpretations that have been used to derive calculations, those interpretations have a basis of logic. It is certainly possible that adjustments to these calculations might be appropriate, and possibly the annual budget impact may be less than a deficit of $10,927,924. However, what is most important is to recognize the reality that if we are to seriously consider increasing the number of residents by any percentage of the magnitude that this MBTA Communities Act establishes, our leaders of Milton have a responsibility to model the cost that may be incurred by the town of Milton so that a decision is made with cost and tax implications to our residents considered. Please find attached the worksheet I presented from last night. I have copied and I name a Milton resident on this email as he provided significant effort and work at my request to prepare this cost implication calculation. Thank you again for your time and commitment to our town. I sincerely appreciate your effort. That was on the 25th of January. I never received a reply from anyone. I didn't receive a reply from any of the select board members. I didn't receive a reply from the town administrator. I eventually prompted the town administrator, and he did reply at that point, which was about a month ago when I prompted him. So my reasoning for asking the question is this was in the hands of the select board that I had prepared. I don't think this is very complicated. This is not difficult to prepare. And if you look at it and you use the data that we have within the town, the extrapolations here are all reasonable. All reasonable. And you have it yourself, Tim. Our town administrator has it. The members of the select board have it. Certainly the members of the select board that are still part of the select board, have it. Those that were members on the 25th of January. And I sincerely feel that there's a responsibility to understand the fiscal implications of this before any vote is taken.
Okay, thank you. Cheryl,
Meredith, I've had my hand up. Yeah.
I was just going to call on you.
Yes, thank
please.
you. Yeah, I don't know if this was your intention when you asked for comment about another board's meeting, but I am not comfortable at all with our board members trying to hold a member of the staff who is a direct report to the town administrator and to the select board, try and hold that person accountable for actions of that other board. I think that's not appropriate at all. And I'm really looking forward to hearing the input and the feedback that we're going to give to UTIL and RKG tonight. I think the select board, in my understanding of what they were trying to do, was to provide feedback. That's what I've said our board needs to do, and we've needed to do it for months, and we've been slow at doing it. I think we need to hear what these consultants have to say tonight so that we can provide that feedback. I really hope that we have time to hear their presentations, to be thoughtful about their presentations, to ask questions and give them feedback. And I really would suggest that we move on to that. Thank you.
Thank you. And
Can I ask a quick question?
yes.
Last time we were together, we spoke about timing, running out of time. I know Cheryl and Tim both agreed that it was going to be very difficult to get this done. And I had asked if we could somehow petition the powers that be to try to get more time. Where are we with that? And does the board feel like we should push forward with that?
Well, I do want to speak to that briefly. I just was going to say that I attended the meeting on Tuesday, and I was stunned and disappointed. We've talked a lot in our town about civility and respect to one another. And what I witnessed in person on Tuesday was a lack of both. We have worked very, very hard on this, and I see what happened. I think there's two ways to approach this, and the way we move forward, and the way we are compliant. Because I think our board has consistently said we want to be compliant. We're going to work towards being compliant, but we don't want to be reckless in doing this. We want to be thoughtful in how we do this and how we approach this, and we all agreed just weeks ago on that process. So I was stunned on Tuesday that there was information that the planning board had not received, that the select board, and I'll just say, the information that was provided to the select board was incomplete. Option 1 did not even provide the outputs, the number of units per each district. That was left blank. It said to be put in, and I'm not sure if we'll have that tonight. But the select board voted on something which, especially in East Milton Square, the last time we saw that, it was 346 units. The select board voted on an option that they have no idea. They have not seen a built-out analysis. They've not seen a fiscal analysis, but they've not seen a built-out analysis of how many units and what that would look like. Because I sat in that meeting and I did not know how many units and 4 stories in East Milton Square. And they voted for that option without that with incomplete information, which I was shocked. So I believe the way we can move forward with this and be compliant, and we can discuss this because we want to move on and we want to hear from our consultants. But Tim, can you, and I can actually read this first, but I want you to explain, and I'm not sure why this wasn't explained to the select board, because I know you did present this to the warrant committee. I'm going to read something on compliance. Enlarge this. EOHLC interprets Section 3A as allowing every MBTA community a reasonable opportunity to enact zoning amendments as needed to come into compliance. Accordingly, EOHLC will recognize both interim compliance, which means an MBTA community is taking active steps to enact a multifamily zoning district that complies with Section 3A, and district compliance, which is achieved when EOHLC determines that an MBTA community has a multifamily zoning district that complies with Section 3A. The requirements for interim and district compliance are described in more detail below. So Tim, can you, just for the public, discuss interim compliance and what that would mean, what our process would be, what our timeline and our steps for interim compliance would be, and the advantages of our moving forward with that process?
So the interim compliance is really about, the law was passed in January of 21. And, the law doesn't have deadlines in it, right? The law just says, these are what the requirements are. You shall have this. The housing agency shall promulgate guidelines. So technically, the law is effective when the law passes. So, in a legal sense, no one was compliant with MBTA communities as of the date of the passage of the law. So what DHCD at the time did in their compliance guidelines, which the law requires them to produce, was set up a series of interim compliance sort of checkpoints. And you remember these. The first one that came out was basically a requirement for the town planner to brief the select board on the guidelines, which I did back in, I think, March of 22. The other, interim compliance measure at that time was sort of like a simple information sheet about housing in the town of Milton. So we achieved that interim compliance, checkpoint in 2022 via that. So that basically meant that even though we hadn't passed zoning, which law requires, we were compliant because we met the interim compliance, checkpoint that the guidelines put in. The next interim compliance checkpoint was the action plan that we submitted in January. And again, what this means is you're compliant in 22 if you do the briefing of the select board and the information sheet so that you're eligible for all the grant programs and there's no penalties. You're compliant in 23 if you achieve interim compliance via submitting an action plan by January 31st, 23. There are no more interim compliance checkpoints that are explicitly stated in the guidelines. The next checkpoint is the deadline for creating zoning. So, on a formal basis, there is no more interim compliance to be had. It's really just you hit the deadline or you don't hit the deadline for passing zoning.
So would there be a way to ask for an extension of interim compliance?
We could ask. It just becomes up to HLC to say yes or no. You can ask them whatever you want. I haven't heard of other communities contemplating that. I think everyone is, trying to hit their deadline of the end of the year.
Mm-hmm. So maybe we can be the first. I'm sorry.
Go ahead. I'm sorry, Jim.
I was going to say, so maybe we can be the first, similar to our reclassification letter. I don't think anybody's asked for that either, but the select board sent a watered down letter. So maybe this board can send a strong letter asking for a little more time.
It seems like it's worth asking. As if they know that there is real work being done with our consultants. But is there anyone else before we move on? But I wanted to address I believe it's the planning board who was elected to perform and to really do a thoughtful plan for zoning for the town, and we'd like to focus on that. So let's move and introduce our consultants. Tim, if you'd like to make those introductions and tee this up.
Sure. So first, and hopefully he's still with us, we've got Eric Halverson from RKG Associates. RKG, as you know, was selected as our chosen consultant to perform the fiscal impact analysis of the zoning. So Eric, if you can just kind of talk through a little bit about yourself, your firm, your methodology, kind of what you've been up to so far, what information you still need, and maybe if you can give us a sort of a timeline for for a final product.
Sure, no problem. Thanks, Tim. Hello, members of the planning board. My name is Eric Halverson. I am a principal with RKG Associates, and I manage our Boston office. We have an office right in downtown Boston, so nice and close to Milton. RKG, if you're not familiar with our firm, we've been around for 42 years, always based here in New England. We also have offices in Alexandria, Virginia, and in Dallas, Texas. We're a small firm, but we do work nationally. And I think the firm was sort of founded, and I think hopefully most well known for our work around economic development, market analytics, and then working with both public and private sector clients on fiscal and economic impacts and sort of measuring those impacts. In the last, I would say, 10 to 15 years, we've gotten much more involved in the housing realm. We do work for HUD, we do work for states, and then we do work for cities and towns around affordable housing, comprehensive housing strategies, and things like that. Most recently, related to MBTA communities, my firm, along with one other, was asked to work with Mass Housing Partnership and EOHLC, helping them to flesh out the guidelines, and then most importantly, we built the compliance model that all 177 communities are required to use, and had a lot of input on that process. We created all the training materials for consultants and communities, and did a lot of early technical assistance, sort of testing both the GIS components of MBTA communities modeling and the compliance model. So we're trying to leverage that work and our familiarity with MBTA communities to, help communities like Milton. In this case, it's with a fiscal impact analysis, but we've helped other communities with a whole host of other things. So I'm really happy that we were able to come on board, and I hope that we can provide some clarity, at least on the fiscal impact modeling components of this process.
Great.
And just, I'll try to hit everything quickly that Tim asked about. So I've been working with Tim and other members of town staff on a data request to gather as much detailed and localized data coming directly from departments in Milton, including the schools, finance, police, fire, DPW, so that we could try to make the fiscal impact model as locally relevant and derived from locally available data as much as possible. That's our preference. Sometimes it's not always possible, particularly in very small communities, but in a community like Milton, it's been really easy to get that data. It's taken a little bit of time, of course, because everyone's busy, but we've gotten a lot of really great information. We've taken that and we have started to build out the actual fiscal impact model, knowing that hoping that there would be decisions forthcoming on which districts were going to be decided upon, what the build out of those districts were going to be per the compliance model, what types of housing were going to be envisioned or allowed per zoning in those different districts, and then sort of what the planning board would like us to test in terms of scenarios to run through the fiscal impact model, because there's a couple different options that we can do, and different scenarios and different decisions that we could make that would then impact the outcomes of the fiscal impact model. So right now we've sort of collected, I think we've got everything we need from a data perspective. We're working on building the model, and I would say in a few weeks we'll be ready to come back to you. So long as we have the districts and we understand what we actually need to measure. I think that's probably the biggest outstanding component from my perspective. I'm happy to answer any questions you might have. I don't have a prepared presentation. My assumption for this meeting was just more to say hello and introduce myself, talk about where we are in the process and what's coming up.
Eric, this is Sean. I just had a couple of questions, if you don't mind. Love to ask.
Sure.
With respect to the major, I guess, departments within the town, obviously police, fire, school are very big, and probably other departments that the budgets aren't as big. Is it simply the number of housing units that is the driver of the modeling? Or is it location of where the units are? How would location of the units affect some of your calculations?
I don't think it would, unless for some reason you told me or the assessor told me that there was a really substantial difference in assessed valuation from one district to another. Otherwise, we tend to use assessed values from the assessor's office, which I've gathered from them. They were very helpful in that for different housing types. We would usually kind of use an average for new construction that, say, happened over the last few years, because we don't want to use something that was built 30 years ago. It's not going to have the same value as something that's built tomorrow. I would say in terms of the housing typology, that does have an impact. So knowing what types of housing we want to test. So is there going to be a for sale component like condos or townhouses or triplexes, I think someone was talking about earlier, or is it going to be predominantly rental? Those have different assessed values. One has a sales value. One we would weigh from an income approach based on the monthly and annual rents that those units are throwing off. The other reason we would want to know and better understand housing typologies is because larger units often have different school children impacts. They generate different amounts of school children on a per unit basis in our experience. So a studio apartment is going to have a very different education impact from a cost side of things than a 3-bedroom single family house would. I know we're not going to measure that, but just as a kind of on the two extremes. So what we do is we will apply a student generation metric to each of those housing typologies, usually based on bedroom size. And as we know, in almost every town that I've ever worked in, education is usually the dominant part of any municipality's budget. So getting that right and making sure that that's accurate and everybody's comfortable with it is really important. And a lot of that, again, stems from the type of housing that we'll be sort of measuring from a fiscal standpoint.
Great. And Cheryl, you can follow that up. Cheryl,
Yes,
you
yeah,
had your hand up first, actually, so go ahead.
Yeah, thanks, Meredith. A similar question in terms of the districts. We've been talking about the zone capacity and then saying, well, depending upon the district, it might not net the full number of zone capacity because there's existing housing in some districts. And some districts that we're considering there's not. But is that another one of the reasons why the districts are important to your work?
Yeah, I think that's Cheryl, that's such an important point that you make, even though it's related to my work in particular. It's a great point to make overall, and that residents, I think, need to understand. It's not like tomorrow you're going to have 2,000 brand new units. That might, if you ever get it, it might take 50 years. Milton's an established community, and there's beautiful neighborhoods and homes all over. So I think understanding what we call the propensity for change or susceptibility for change in a particular district will help us and hopefully help you estimate. Maybe in some districts it's if the unit capacity is 500, let's say, maybe only 50% of that unit capacity could ever even be realized, or we might want to just make that assumption and test that scenario in the model. The nice thing about the way we'll set up the model is it'll be iterative, so we can, I don't want to say we'll test a million different scenarios, but we can run some sensitivity analyses for you and say, well, if all 2,000 some odd units did build out, I think as one of the board members mentioned earlier from the January memo, it'll be this. But what if only 75% built out, or 50%, or 25%? So I think those are things that we could play with and, hopefully inform, provide more information for you all as you're making your decisions.
So along another line, or another question along similar lines, we have a couple of districts that we're considering that may or may not see some change in use over time, but they would be all new units, and likely because of the size of the parcels and the inputs that we're putting in thus far in terms of what the unit capacity could be there, larger development. So let's say, a 4 or 5 story multifamily that's going to yield maybe hundreds of units. That as compared to a district where the parcel sizes right now that are being talked about, I guess we'll talk about later, but as small as 5,500 square feet. And which would be allowed 3 units. And so if you were to look at that and say, if you got a development on one of the large parcels, you'd be hit with hundreds of units at one time, or most likely pretty close together. But if you're looking at a district where it's small lots, it's more likely to be incremental. Does your financial modeling or forecasting sort of factor that kind of district impact?
Yeah, that's a great question. We don't have a phasing component to it, so to be able to sort of stretch the impact out, the fiscal impact model will assume that whatever we measure is sort of built on day one in a way, and then we try to measure the impact of that. But what I would say to that is, once we run the model, we can also then generate estimates for potential new numbers of residents. And what I think we put in the proposal, and what I would love to do, even if we didn't put it in there, but I'm pretty sure it's in there, would be to then circle back with some of the key departments, so education, police, fire, DPW, those folks, and say, well, if we did get 350 new units dropped here next year, what kind of impact would that have on your staffing, on your equipment, on that kind of capability, and try to put some of that, I hate to call it qualitative, but more of that sort of qualitative departmental input into it. So what we like to do is try to bridge the more sciencey part of the fiscal impact with department input and try to understand how we can bring those two things together to talk about impacts in a comprehensive way.
Okay, and then thank you for those answers. That's helpful. You mentioned that your company built the compliance model. I've been trying to understand how to tinker around with it. I haven't had enough time to really delve into it in any great detail. But there are some things I've read about in terms of being important to the outputs. So we talk about, how many units on a lot versus how many units on an acre. And so where we have lot sizes in Milton, it's as low as probably, I've seen anyway, 3,000 square feet in one of these areas. And then, we have lot sizes of acres. And it seems, so I don't know if you have any kind of comments for us sort of on how that model kind of contemplates that range of parcel sizes in determining compliance. And then similarly, so you can talk about, how many units on a parcel, how many units in an acre, how tall the building is, and how many parking spaces. But what about things that people have asked about, which is open space requirements and lot coverage requirements? And if we put those in, do those get factored into that compliance model such that it might affect the unit count?
Sure. And I don't want to steal any of you Teal's thunder here, but I'm happy to answer the question while I'm on. But
Right.
So on the things that you can factor in from a zoning perspective into the model has a default open space percentage of 20%. The reason that it does is it was very difficult for us and the working group that we had when we were building the model. We kind of had an outside working group of different experts sort of giving us feedback. One thing we had in almost an impossible time figuring out is how to account for setbacks in the model, because you have different parcel sizes, but even more so you have different parcel configurations and dimensions. So to apply a blanket setback in an Excel model to 1,000 different parcels, it was just hard to figure out, like, how do you actually do that subtraction? So to factor in setbacks, we said the model has to have a sort of a blanket 20%, and the intention of that 20% open space set aside is to account for the setbacks. It may be a little bit aggressive in a more urban community, but it might be a little bit more lenient in a very rural community where you have larger setbacks. You can add additional zoning, I would say, restrictions to the model, such as building coverage, parking coverage, maximum lot coverage, which takes both of those into account. You can put in, I believe, an open space per dwelling unit requirement in there if you want. So you could say you have to have 500 square feet of open space on a parcel for every dwelling unit that you have. So there's a lot of those kinds of restrictions, but I'm sure, as you all know, after having gone through this now for several months, the more restrictions you place in the model, the fewer units you're going to get, which will drive down your density requirements. So it's all a give and take, and it's all a series of trade-offs. And, I recognize it's not easy. So, I understand the position that you all are in, especially as a rapid transit community with a looming deadline. On the parcel sizes, I will say the model is a little bit more forgiving on very large parcels. So if you have tested large parcels, you may have seen that the model returns, as long as your zoning is not too restrictive, it'll return some pretty big numbers in terms of unit capacity. And then on the smaller lots, because you have less area to work with, and the model has to take into account, say on that 3,000 square foot lot, it needs to take into account the building footprint that it needs to achieve 3 units or more. It then takes the 20% open space as a factor, and then it takes parking as a factor. So once it takes all those things, you're continually shrinking your building envelope. And if that building envelope gets to a point where it becomes too small, the model will just kick out a 0. It'll say you can't actually build on that lot. So I think the model works. It works good in most of the situations, but it is pretty restrictive on smaller lots. And then as you get to those larger parcels, I think it gets a little bit more forgiving.
The more forgiving, meaning it's going to be harder for it to kick it out to contemplate what development might be. Is that
just more forgiving in that you have a lot more land area to work with when it comes to, say, it's a 5-acre parcel, for example. it's going to show a pretty high unit count on there, so long as your zoning isn't very restrictive, because it's just taking the 20% of open space and then it's factoring in the parking, and you're still left with on a parcel of that size, you would still be left with a fairly large building footprint, at least in the model you would be. So
can I ask you another question on that?
Sure.
Can the model contemplate multiple buildings on a larger parcel then, so that you would have, or can you increase the default from 20% open space to something larger?
Yes, you absolutely can change the default to be above 20%. So you can do that. Of course, if you change it to 60%, it's gonna, I think the cell turns red as a flag for EOHLC. Same with setbacks. If you put a 100-foot front yard setback, the cell will turn red, just as a flag for them to say, is the community trying to, do something that might be a little bit strange. So you can absolutely play with that. The model it asks the question if your zoning allows more than one building on a lot. It asks that question, but I don't think there's any way to actually measure that using the model. It'll just give you the unit count, and then it would obviously be up to whoever is going to, if someone ever chooses to build there, it'd be up to them sort of how they do that. Do they do it in one big building, or do they do it phased in multiple buildings, depending on the size of the lot and how many units they could get.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Eric, I'm sorry.
I just was going to say, I just wanted to just say thank you, and it's so nice to know that we have somebody with such great experience working on this. Could you just address sort of with the other communities maybe that you're working with, what would you see are a realistic timeline on when we could, from the time that we have our completed districts, which obviously you need that information before you really jump in. What kind of, likely period of time are we looking at to be able to create this?
Are you speaking just on the fiscal impact component?
On the fiscal impact, yes, correct.
Oh, sure. Well, since we don't need the results of the modeling in the districts to build the model itself. So that's why we're kind of trying to front load that work. This way, when we do get the results from that and talk to you all and Tim about what kinds of scenarios you want to run, I think it should go pretty quickly, maybe just a handful of weeks, so that we have some time to run it and make sure everything is, coming out how we want it to, and then have some time to put together a presentation, come back, visit with you, share the findings. So I don't think it'll take that long once we get the results.
Okay. Eric, Sean again, with a few more questions, if you don't mind. You mentioned the 20% open space is a default that the model has. Are there other defaults that the model has also that you could share with us?
I'm trying to think. So the one that comes to mind is, there's a couple. So on the way the model calculates unit capacity is kind of a default calculation, in that it uses an average of 1,000 square feet per unit to calculate, to translate square feet of development into actual units. So that's one default. The reason why we used 1,000 square feet, it's probably a little bit big for an apartment, at least these days it probably is. But we also needed the model to be able to recognize that people might do, some communities might allow a triple decker, and those might be 1,500, 1,600, 1,800 square feet, or a townhouse, a 3-story townhouse that might be 2,500 square feet. So we chose 1,000. It's a pretty standard measure in our world. So that is something that would be a default. Parking is kind of a default. You can put in a parking ratio. You have to put in a parking ratio for your districts and the zoning. But in the back end, there are ranges of parking. I think it goes from like 0 to 0.5 per unit, 0.5 to 1, 1 to 1.5, 1.5 to 2, and then above 2. And there are percentages of the lot that are associated with each of those ranges. So I'm just making this up because I can't remember the exact number, but if your parking ratio was 1 space per unit, the model might take a default of 10% of every lot that you apply that to, and we just say that 10% is going to go to parking, 20% is going to go to the open space and setbacks. Then what you're left with is the building footprint, and that's what that's what then the model calculates unit capacity over. I think they're probably the two other big defaults, but I might be forgetting one.
And going back to something you mentioned earlier, propensity for change, susceptibility for change, how do you arrive at that?
The way we've done it in the past is usually just trying to look at value of a building compared to, sometimes we might do like a building improvement to land value ratio, just some way to say these properties are potentially undervalued, and if someone were to purchase them, there would be value there to capture, by changing it from, I don't know, maybe a small commercial building or something to a 50-unit multifamily development. So that's usually the way that we've tackled it, is by looking at the valuation and trying to figure out what parcels might be some early movers.
So okay, so that's, I guess that's a fair amount of work for you guys, isn't it, to try to evaluate existing value to be able to develop a propensity for change, right?
Well, we use the town's assessor database, which has all that information built into it.
Yeah.
Has the land value, the building improvement value, and then total. So we look at that. I mean, the other thing I think is somebody had mentioned before, it sounds like in some of the potential districts you're considering, there might be some either vacant or underutilized properties that might support larger scale development. So, those might be early movers as well, if they don't have, a $1 million house sitting on top of them right now and, have a lower value, or might not have any building improvement at all.
Yeah, and I think that's what Cheryl referred to earlier. An empty lot probably would have 100% propensity for change, right? Because there's nothing that would stop it really from being developed. But
yeah, I mean, in a community like Milton, where I assume everybody's got water and sewer and it's served by transportation, and I guess as long as there weren't any environmental constraints, either brownfields environmental or things like wetlands or any kind of constraints on that, then yeah, I mean, probably would make a lot of sense to develop there.
So I have one more question. So one of the new things that came about last week is a commercial, first floor commercial, that is allowed in villages, which I'm sure is changing everything that you're running, all your numbers. How is that working out? And with commercial districts, because we have a limited commercial, but we are zoning in those areas. So both of the lower mills along the rapid transit area, East Milton Square, how does that play into your factoring your numbers?
I unfortunately, my answer for this one is probably less satisfactory than my other ones, in that I don't know yet. This just came out last week. I attended the HLC has office hours, usually on Fridays for, I think anybody can join, but it's usually the consultants. They gave a presentation to all the consultants on sort of what this is, how they anticipate measuring it. They explained the whole, it's essentially an offset. I can get into it. I can try to get into it if you want. Just let me know. But essentially, it'll be an offset to your total unit count. There is no model for measuring it yet. That needs to be built, and that will take some time. I don't have a timeline on that yet. And once built, it's going to need to be tested. So I don't know exactly when that's going to come out. Which for rapid transit communities potentially looking to take advantage of this puts the time crunch on you, I think, even more.
That might be good feedback for
sure.
HLC, in communicating the challenges that communities are having to understand the fiscal analysis for these requirements.
Yeah. Do you have a zoning district today that mandates mixed use? In order to build something, it has to be mixed use?
Yes, commercial.
Okay. And are you contemplating that as a 3A district, or will that be left alone?
Sorry, to go ahead.
So,
Tim. Yeah.
so yes, try to jump in, Mary. So we have we have two major commercial districts, which we're exploring 3A districts in each of them. And one of them, I mean, just to sort of answer your question, we did pass overlay zoning in one of those districts that mandated mixed use, but it was, an overlay over a business district, which now will have another overlay over that potentially. Right. But yeah, that's kind of the state of play where we're in right now.
Got it. Okay.
Great.
So I just have a question, if you don't mind. I'm wondering, when you do your analysis, do you take into consideration Milton's historic annual growth rate? And then do you presume a percentage of development each year? And do you presume it like for a short term? And what's your time frame for a short term? Is it like 1 to 5 years? And then for medium term and long term? And then my second question is, do you think 1,000 square feet per unit is an appropriate size for family housing?
Okay, well, let me take the questions, I guess, one at a time. So for the model that we're going to build in the proposal that we submitted, it's sort of a one-time analysis to say if this all built out here at, however much development we choose as a group to assume in the scenario modeling, it's sort of a point in time analysis saying, like, if this was built tomorrow, here's what would be the potential fiscal impacts. Using Milton's historical growth is an interesting question in that I'm guessing Milton has never had a by right multifamily district like most communities in Massachusetts. And obviously it's yet to be seen what impact that's going to have on potentially speeding up development, because you're removing so many barriers, particularly if you require a special permit process in your community and that special permit process is lengthy. Removing those barriers and allowing by right multifamily could potentially result in more development over a shorter period of time than what the town may have otherwise been, used to historically. So, it's certainly something we could consider. I just, like so much of this, I'm not sure how realistic that would be. And then, sorry, I apologize. What was the last question?
The size of a unit.
Oh.
You said your base is 1,000 square foot per unit. Is that like an appropriate size for a family with children?
Yeah, I mean, it is. Let's say if we were looking at an apartment building, a typical 3-bedroom might be somewhere around 1,100, 1,200 square feet. So I don't think, as an average of units, I don't think we're far off. But if you were only building, well, you can't mandate bedroom size anyway with fair housing. But let's say you could, if you were only building family-sized units, then 1,000 might be a little bit small. But
because isn't this for families? There can't be any restrictions.
Well, so you're right that there can't be any restrictions in the zoning that would preclude family-sized units from being built. So in the past, we've seen some communities that say, you can't build 3-bedroom units, or they would try to sort of position the zoning in a way that it would be so restrictive to build larger units that it would just because of the way the regulations were written, you kind of were forced to build smaller units that weren't family sized. So what the guidelines say is, you don't have, like, a developer or whoever wouldn't be forced to build family-sized units, but the zoning cannot preclude it through the written language in the zoning.
Great. And Cheryl, you had your hand up.
Yes, thanks. I meant to ask about FAR, so floor area ratio as a restriction in the model. Can you talk about that, whether that's allowed to be put in, and if you've seen what kind of impact that has on the unit count that's allowed?
It absolutely is an input in the model. So there is a box where you can input an FAR. The FAR would have different impacts depending on, I think the composition of your district and the size of the parcels. It would have a different output, or I guess a different impact depending on the district and the parcel composition.
I guess what I'm getting at with that was just that question about unit size, because obviously you could do 3 units at 1,000 square feet average and you're at 3,000, or you could do 3 units at 2,000 square feet and you're at 6,000, right? So, I mean, how big a building it is obviously going to be the same number of units, but the size of the units is going to affect the FAR, or what's allowed, how much total building area there is. So that FAR restriction could impact the unit size, I guess, in some ways.
It absolutely could, because that's going to establish your total building area, like your building envelope, essentially. Right. And then that building envelope, the square feet of that building envelope is going to get divided by 1,000, and that'll be your unit count. So you are right, especially on smaller parcels, that would have an impact. But there's nowhere in the model, I'm pretty sure there's nowhere in the model where you as the user could designate a unit size. The unit size is fixed. So you're right. FAR could potentially, it could make a parcel, undevelopable if you set the FAR, too low.
It seems like you really want to have an opportunity to tinker with, if you will, the FAR, the open space, the lot coverage, so that you can get something closest to matching up with existing character. Because what most people are concerned about is that we have established neighborhoods. Many of the homes that were built late 1800s, early 1900s, 1920s, etc., and that character is valued. And so, these tools, other than design standards, these zoning tools are what we have right now, right, to kind of drive that. And so, have you been involved in other communities, or have you tested the model where you've really been able to go back and forth on this to test out what the build-out model physically would be, not just numbers?
Oh, like translate it to an actual parcel and see how that would do. We've done that on 2 occasions, but I would say those were really specific cases where the parcel was quite large. In one case, it was about a 30-acre parcel adjacent to a commuter rail station, where they had a property owner / developer that was really interested in doing something there. So we sort of worked with the town staff, the residents of that area that would be sort of visually impacted by that, and the developer, to model out in a 3-dimensional manner sort of how that could potentially play out. And it was a back and forth between, we would sort of run the model, okay, can we get to the unit count that we need to satisfy the requirements and the guidelines for this community? How much of it is going to be within the half-mile radius of the commuter rail station to meet the requirements? And then does the sort of architectural and building size and scale and character, is it in line with what the neighborhood had envisioned? And then most importantly, I think for the developer, is that financially viable? Because it was their parcel. That was sort of key to unlocking compliance. So we have done that in a couple occasions. We haven't modeled it on kind of a, in Milton, I imagine you've got some neighborhoods that have smaller parcels, as you mentioned before. We haven't modeled it like in a neighborhood that has 250 parcels or something like that. Like, what would that look like?
So how long did it take you to run through that analysis for that one example you just gave? Like, if we were trying to think about, I'm thinking like if we picked a 5,500 square foot lot and a 7,500 square foot lot and a 10,000 square foot lot, and we wanted to get that kind of analysis, that modeling that you just talked about. is it, how much back and forth and how much time? I mean, obviously, we wouldn't be having a developer. What we'd be testing it against is the model, you know, what we're required to do, right? So.
Yeah, like the three-dimensional component of it.
Mm-hmm.
Tim, I hope I'm not stepping on your toes for the next piece.
You too. Yeah, that's all right. Yeah.
Well, we can ask the same questions of them, and we'll get two expert opinions.
We're all pals here.
That's great. Thank you so much. This has been really helpful information.
Can I ask one last question? Eric, before you leave us, have you completed this for any of the communities?
The fiscal impact model?
Yes.
No, we actually are doing it in sort of 3 communities right now. But we have used this fiscal impact model, not for MBTA communities, but for other types of projects.
Okay. And the 3 communities that you're doing it for, are they rapid transit communities?
One is a commuter rail community and one is an adjacent community.
Okay.
Sorry, and then I forgot to ask, are you going to analyze what the cost to the town will be in the loss of permit fees for variances and special permits?
So I would say, and you can tell me if this is right or wrong based on your experience, typically those, what we consider to be like one-time sources of revenue, so things like building permits or application fees, special permit fees, the way we've always looked at them is that they're supposed to be designed with a nexus in mind, that the amount of work that goes in from the staff perspective or the building department's perspective is sort of supposed to equal what you're charging someone for that fee. So we try to look at that as hopefully that's kind of a wash for the community. And what we really try to focus on are the annual recurring revenues that come from, in this case, the property taxes.
And then also to just follow up, enforcement is a big thing in our town. So I think that is a recurring cost. And as I understand it, the town has just put in now for a new code enforcement officer. So I think, as I talked to the code enforcement officer yesterday, that most of his time is not spent on building permits. They're spent on enforcement issues. So I think you probably should check in with them to see how much time they are, because that is a recurring cost and we have to hire a new personnel.
Great,
Quick question?
thanks for that.
Yep. One more question and then we'll move
Eric,
on to
just one quick question for you. Are you taking into consideration building out basements in your modeling, the potential of basement space?
No, well, I haven't run across that instance or that question. So I guess my quick answer would be no, only because in the model they ask you for height and stories, and we had always assumed that height would go vertically, not not down. It would go up. But I guess you could. Let's say that you wanted to allow 2 stories of vertical construction and you wanted to assume 1 story of below grade living space. You could say in the model that it's a 3-story building. It's just 2 stories happen to go up and 1 happens to go down. You know what I mean?
Mm-hmm.
No, I know exactly what you mean. My biggest fear is that basements are overlooked, and when we pass this zoning, you're going to have no problem putting a 3-family in because you can pop a studio in the basement all day long. Most basements have the ceiling height. So it's going to happen, and that would have a severe impact on, neighborhoods. That's 1 more couple with 2 more cars or 1 more car. So I'm just concerned that gets looked at. And I don't know how to do it. I'm just throwing it out there.
Yeah, if that's a common typology in Milton, like I said, I guess one way you could do it would be to add an additional story to the height in the model if you wanted to capture it. If you want, I'm not sure I'm not sure how they would look at that question. I don't know if they would allow you to count a below grade unit in the model. My guess is no. But like for the fiscal impact component, if we wanted to play with that, we could. But from a compliance perspective, that's an interesting question. I haven't heard that one yet.
I think it's definitely going to happen. There will be build-out in basements. Legally. Because it's not difficult
Or
to do.
third floor attics, yeah. Okay. Anything else, Tim, that you wanted to mention, or?
No. So I guess the takeaway here is as soon as we've settled on some districts and some general zoning parameters, we can get those to Eric and he can start running his model. The other thing, Eric, just in terms of, I guess, I know we're not talking about time horizons, but I mean, we'll be able to run multiple scenarios in the sense of what if 500 units get built out? What if 1,000 units get built out? What if all of the units get built out? So, it's not a time horizon thing, but you can kind of back into a time horizon that way.
Yes. I think that's right. If anyone has, I didn't want anyone to have expectations that the model's built with an inflation factor over time, or the sort of accounting for the time value of money, or anything like that. It's a snapshot in time. From the dollar perspective, we would use 2023 dollars for everything.
Okay.
So I have a follow-up. So from what you just said, you're kind of waiting for us to provide some districts. But I don't know if you were on, but Member Fahey mentioned that he did a preliminary cost analysis just based on the number of units and made assumptions. So I'm wondering, are you able to do that? Because I think it is going to take us quite a bit of time to work through the districts, and we would not want to hold up your analysis. So it'd be helpful to us, I think, for you to move forward as quickly as you can, with hopefully not totally relying on us, if that's possible.
Sure. I mean, I guess one example, if we wanted to run the maximum scenario, like what your I guess your required floor is, the 2,000 some odd units. We could do that. And then I guess I was thinking in my own head, and maybe this was an incorrect assumption on my part, but I was thinking that we would want to run scenarios for those districts at least at some point with you, just to say, okay, if this is what we're going to move forward with, here are the potential impacts.
Yeah, I think, Eric, from my perspective, if you could even just give us order of magnitude, right? And without the districts being identified, we really need to put information forth to the residents so the residents can understand it. And, I, like Maggie, am concerned for the time that will go by as we try to get as dialed in as Tim's he's doing a great job trying to get us dialed in, but that's going to take us weeks. Yeah. So, Tim, I guess where I'm going is if Eric could give us, hey, if you ever did 100%, or, here's the evaluation, if it was 75%, if that's all you were ever able to achieve, or if it was 50%, even if you had 100%, 75%, 50%, we'd at least have something to work with. And Tim would probably have it quickly, I mean, I don't think it's just us. As I said earlier, I think the select board would want to see that too. Again, it's information that will be helpful as both boards consider what we're dealing with.
Yes, Cheryl, one more question and then
just along along those lines of what Sean and Maggie just suggested, it seems to me we have some consensus on a couple of the districts, at least, the Granite Ave and the sort of bookends of Milton Village and Unquity House areas. So I guess I'm thinking that could be a starting point. It seems like the areas that I think anyway seem to have a lot more work to be done is that sort of connecting the two transit areas with the Elliott Street corridor, as we might call it. looking to get that, meet the requirement for contiguous area, but not get too many units, more than we need in that area. So that's the one that has all the smaller lot sizes, or the, and these other ones that I mentioned that seem like there's consensus on are the sort of larger lot areas, or where there's multifamily already. So it seems to me that if you can do sort of phased analysis for us, even though what the output won't be phased, that could be helpful.
That's a great suggestion, because I think we are moving in the right direction, and we do have some consensus on some of those, so, yeah.
Eric, does that make it difficult for you? I mean, if we just said simply, without zone-specific information, just calculate 175, 50, how long would that take to do that type of an exercise? I know you still have data to input.
Yeah, I would say a few weeks. I just need to, maybe a couple weeks.
Yeah.
Sean, I was just thinking back to the question that you asked too. One other way we could do it, just while we're waiting for the finalization of the districts, we could provide basically a net fiscal impact number on a per unit basis, and just say, hey, if you built like a typical apartment, this is the net fiscal impact, basically the revenues minus the costs associated with that unit. If you built a townhouse, it might be this. If you built a condominium, it might be this. So we could pick 2 or 3 different housing typologies, and then say just on a per unit basis. So if you built one of those units, you might have net revenue of $500. I'm just making it up, but so then you could essentially say, well, we want to build out 250 of those kinds of units. You could pretty quickly just do the math.
I think that would be very helpful.
Well, the problem is we can't control that. That will be a variable we can't control, whether it's condos or apartments. We can't determine that.
Yeah,
but we could run
course.
that. So we could maybe say, if it's apartments, it would be this, and if it's condos, it would be this on that same parcel. So we're giving the two, depending on which way it would end up being developed. So, okay. Good. This is really helpful.
Great. I'm glad.
Good. Very. Yeah. Look forward to working with you. So thank you.
Same.
So,
Eric, thanks very much.
And Eric, we'll be in touch next week. And Meredith, I may want to just kind of maybe double check with you, if that's okay, on kind of precisely what the asks are, and we can get Eric to work on some of these interim products.
Eric, are you available to come on I think we should have you, if you can, join us on September 14th to see where we are with some of the work you're doing, just to check in.
That's the next meeting?
Yeah. And the following meeting is September 28th. Would be great.
The 28th I can definitely make. The 14th I potentially have a conflict.
Okay.
I'll put that in my calendar now.
Yeah, and we'll work to feed you information as quickly as possible. So.
Okay, cool. Great. Okay, I'll put I'll hold the 28th in my calendar.
Great.
Tim, in order for Eric to have everything that he needs ultimately, can you collect any of the inputs that Eric's going to need for us? Cheryl brought up the FAR earlier. Anything that we have that we could just understand that we have to think about would be helpful. Or are you going to answer all of those questions for him, for Eric?
Yeah, I mean, what I plan on doing, and this is where Util's work is going to come in, is all of those zoning inputs go into the compliance model worksheet, which I can just feed to Eric, which has if there's parcels to be had, the parcels are there, but just the general sort of zoning parameters for anything that we do will be in those model worksheets.
Okay, great, thank you.
Yeah, and the thing about FAR is, and again, we're stealing a lot of Util's thunder, but there's a lot of overlapping parameters in the model. So there's like a overall density, 30 units per acre, or 30 units per lot, or open space, lot coverage. So, by the time you get to FAR, just to use an example, you may have already covered all of the things that FAR would cover.
Sure.
So there's a lot of overlapping stuff there, and Zoe and Rahi will talk about that in a minute. All of that information is in one place, and we can feed it directly to them.
Great. Thanks.
Thanks a lot, Eric. We'll be in touch on Monday.
That's great.
Okay. Have a great night.
Thank you, Eric.
Thank you.
Bye.
Great, and we can now introduce Tim, if you would like to introduce our next consultant from UTL. Consultants.
So I have Rahi and Zoe from UTL are going to be joining us as panelists, and you should have screen sharing capabilities. Zoe and Rahi have been excellent to us, very responsive and very good with this model. So I'll just, if they can just take it away, they can go ahead and take it away.
Happy to. Well, nice to meet you all. My name is Zoe Mueller. I'm an urban planner and an associate at UTL. And I grew up in Cambridge, not so far away. So I have a lot of sort of built-in understanding of sort of the context that you're dealing with and the complexity of the issues that you're wrestling with. So we'll do our best to get you kind of fully oriented here, and you should please feel free to jump in with questions. There may be some things we'll say, we'll get to that in a moment. We have another slide on that, just to sort of give you the best experience, but we're here to answer your questions, so please feel free to jump in. So with that, I know that you have all been engaging with these ideas for a while now, but I do want to just give you all a little bit of a sort of baseline of some of the questions that do tend to come up frequently, just that everyone's sort of operating from the same juncture. And I also want to make note that Rahi is really our wizard behind the scenes here. He's been doing this for a lot of communities, and so he's got a really strong understanding of the nitty-gritty technical details, so he'll be chiming in kind of when we go into that territory. So I'll give you a kind of quick background on some of the questions that actually have already kind of come up, so I'll cruise through those, and then we want to introduce you to the sub-districts that we've been evaluating, sort of in collaboration with MAPC and the planning staff. There's two options for compliance that we want to show you tonight for your consideration, and then we're happy to, given the direction of the conversation thus far, to go into some of the details of kind of the thinking that's gone into the transit area triplex district, because I imagine we'll be kind of revisiting and revising that with you quite a bit. So with that, I'll jump right in. So this is like the super basics. Multifamily is defined through this law as 3 units or more. So a duplex does not count towards this. It's 3 units or more per lot. And it has to be as of right, which means it's not special permit, it's by right zoning. And this is sort of, coming from initially, there was no required ground floor commercial allowed, as you all kind of heard probably at this point. That has been altered somewhat, so there is sort of a narrow pathway to include that as part of your overall approach to compliance, but it cannot be the dominant approach. So just, it's still a sort of important constraint to keep in mind. You are still allowed to use site plan review, which is really important for a lot of the sort of character considerations that you have been bringing up thus far, right? So the by right zoning does, ensure a path to approval, but that doesn't mean that you're rescinding every opportunity to have a conversation with that developer, that property owner, about how they're going about doing the things. So that's really important to remember, that it's not sort of a complete release of the powers that you have to kind of engage in those conversations and sort of affect a better outcome when somebody comes in with a proposal that you're not keen on. The only limitation here is you cannot use this as a way to impede or prevent a development from moving forward. You do have to work collaboratively with them to get to a point where they can move forward. The basics, you'll see these numbers pop up quite a bit. For Milton, in terms of district size and location, you have to get to 50 acres at minimum, and you have to get to a total density of 15 units per acre. And then there's also parameters about where that development is occurring. So it has to be 50% of the district area needs to be in one contiguous area. and 50% of it needs to be within a half mile of rapid transit stations. And then there's a second sort of parameter that goes along with that 50%. 50% of the modeled unit capacity, so the number of units that are being modeled to be produced in these districts, 50% of those need to occur within half a mile of rapid transit stations, which is sort of, if you go back to the spirit of the law, that's about, this being transit-oriented development, so development that is tied into where transit service exists. This is sort of stating a lot of those parameters in a slightly different way. And noting that there's also an additional sort of target here that you have to get to a specific unit count minimum of 2,461. And then just noting on the bottom left here, there's quite a few different zoning parameters that you're allowed to use. As a reminder, there's certain things that you cannot restrict. So you cannot restrict the unit size, you cannot restrict the bedroom count, because those are interact with fair housing and would be considered a form of discrimination against folks that can live or cannot live in those units. So there's a lot of sort of confusion and mystery about what exactly the model is. So we wanted to just sort of address that head on. And Eric has already given you a great overview of a lot of these things. But the first thing to just kind of to frame what it does is this is not intended to be a projection of what will happen. It is intended to be a standardized way that every community that is subject to this law can be sort of held accountable in a consistent way. So it's a tool for sort of estimation that's intended to make sure that everyone's getting equal treatment and that there's a reasonable way to confirm if a community has actually achieved compliance. So that being said, the sort of the back end of the model is it's a spreadsheet with a lot of different parameters and a bunch of defaults. Defaults are things that we cannot change. Those are things that are true for everyone. And then, and that's the 1,000 square foot per unit that you heard Eric mention, which is intended to not be a mandate that you build that 1,000 square foot, but instead a way of essentially averaging out or approximating an average of the range of unit types that might come out of this. So again, it's an estimation tool, not a prediction tool. And then there's a lot of sort of the sort of conversation around this tends to go to density metrics like units per acre, units per lot, which are pretty abstract for folks to sort of make sense of. So that's kind of, acknowledging that they're not the most intuitive tool. They are the most sort of one of the most direct ways to affect how the model is producing numbers on the back end. And so you're going to see that throughout the presentation. It has a similar effect to some of these other parameters that you see kind of listed on the second bullet point here. So minimum and maximum lot size have a very direct impact on the modeled unit capacity. Building height has a very direct impact. As I mentioned, units per acre and units per lot have a very direct impact. And then open space and lot coverage requirements have an extremely similar impact to the units per acre and units per lot parameters. So we expect that as this conversation progresses and we get into more kind of details that we will talk about the open space and lot coverage. We've held it back for now because the more variables you introduce at this scale or this juncture in the conversation, the more convoluted it gets because every decision you make in one spot has an impact on your options in another spot. And so it's important to kind of stay as much as we can in that sort of big picture zone until we have some level of consensus on the overall approach or the rationale for why we're putting certain kinds of districts in certain places. And then we can drill into those details and really fine tune it and make sure that it's lining up with what you're going for. So to that end, it is also important to reiterate what Eric already mentioned, which is that setbacks, the actual numbers of the individual setbacks do not have a direct impact on the model output. They do have a very real impact in the real world on what's possible on a parcel. But the way that the model accounts for that is through this default open space percentage, the 20% that you heard Eric mention. And so when you inch up above that 20%, it does start to affect the number of units that you're producing. But our experience thus far has been that in instances where we already have a units per lot or units per acre metric, the open space and lot coverage requirements have a negligible sort of additional impact beyond that initial impact of the units per acre and units per lot. So they're in here because they're really important for people to visualize what we're talking about. But ultimately, the most direct control is going to be those open space, lot coverage, and units per acre or units per lot. So there's a lot of super sort of technical in the weeds stuff, but it's really important foundation so that as we start to talk about those parameters in the context of specific districts, we're kind of all on the same page about how that ties in with the model. So why don't I, before I sort of go forward, why don't I stop there and see if there's any questions on that so far, and then I'll get into the sub-districts themselves.
I'm good.
I'm good.
All set?
Yeah.
Okay. Great. Okay. So over the arc of this project, in sort of conversations with the planning department and with MAPC, and hearing sort of secondhand some of the input that they've gotten from you, these are the full range of districts that we have evaluated in our study. And this includes, on this graphic, we're showing the reduced transit area triplex, but we did start with the entirety of that half-mile area, and we can walk you through later the reasons why we've sort of pared it down a little bit. So we included in this the Milton Station and Mattapan Station areas, Granite Ave, which has just that the upper portion of it is included in the transit area buffer. The transit area triplex, which is sort of a reduced footprint from the other versions that we've studied. And then the more kind of outlying districts that you see kind of in a sort of belt along the more southern parts of the town are East Milton Square, the Randolph Ave and Access Road, Randolph Ave South, which is almost at the town line, and Brush Hill Road on the sort of west of the town. So just to kind of zoom in and give you a little bit of a sense of, the specifics where we're talking about, these are the Granite Ave parcels that are included in the district that we studied. The Milton Station area that's being considered, the Mattapan Station area, the transit area triplex district that we've been sort of talking about in various points in tonight's meeting, East Milton Square, which coincides with the sort of the boundaries that have been studied in the context of the rezoning work there. Randolph Ave and Access Road, which essentially takes some of the sort of rear parcels set back a little bit from Randolph Ave, with one kind of getting all the way up to Randolph Ave, and then Randolph Ave South. And finally, Brush Hill Road on the to the west. So cut to the chase here. These are the two sort of viable pathways or sort of frameworks, approaches to compliance that we think are worth considering and discussing with you tonight. The first is sort of built around the sort of the transit area, the group of districts that touch or have contact with the transit area, as well as East Milton Square. And the second assumes not using East Milton Square and instead relying on the other districts to sort of round out the picture. And as a sort of note, this is really, they're packages. So once you start pulling it apart, you really have to bring in the full picture again, because each individual sub-district is contributing sort of in a particular way to the overall compliance, because you have quite a few different compliance targets that you need to hit simultaneously. So the first one with East Milton Square, what that looks like on the map is the sort of collection that are grouped around the Mattapan Trolley here, and then Granite Ave and East Milton Square down below. And This is a lot of numbers all at once. This on the right side, these are the numbers that in the select board meeting we had not yet filled out individually. So we've now gone back and filled all those in so you can see the full picture. The parameters that you see in red here are ones that we are expecting to continue tweaking to try and bring them down a little bit. It's important to see kind of where you land overall before going back to revise individual parameters. So we're kind of highlighting those for you as a way of saying, like, there, whatever room we have to play with, this is where we think we should sort of keep tinkering. So what we inputted here is for Granite Ave, Mattapan Station, and Milton Station, holding those all at a 40 units per acre. And for across all of the districts, we've assumed 1 parking space per unit. And then you can see in this sort of central column here, the max building height. And right now we're defining those in terms of stories. Once we get further along, you can include a metric of the number of stories and the measured height of the building, which between the two of them can manage that basement issue that you brought up earlier. So we can circle back to that once we're at that level of detail. But what this is doing now is saying how many stories of development are allowed in this district. So we have in Granite Ave 5, that's the highest we go. The next one down is 4 stories for East Milton Square, and then coming down to 3.5 for the 2 station areas, and 3 for the transit area triplex. Our expectation is that we should continue trying to bring this 4 and 3 down as we fine tune this if we choose to move forward with this one. And so the main thing to focus on here to sort of understand, how much room you have to play in this scenario is looking at the lineup between each of these green cells and the cell below them. So the cell below them tells you what you're required to hit in order to be considered compliant with this law. So in places where you see something that's pretty close, so for 2,508 units, is pretty close to 2,461. So you can't bring that unit number too much further down before you're going to start hitting that compliance minimum. You're well over in terms of acreage, which is a reflection of the preference to have lower density development. That acreage number would come down if you chose to go higher density in some of these areas. The density that you're hitting right now is 19.2. The minimum you need to hit is 15, so you have a little bit of room to play there. And then these metrics here are the targets that are related to the requirement for this to be transit oriented. So this is by land area, this is by units. And in both cases, you're well above the 50% minimum that you need to hit because the preference is, of the units we've been looking at, a lot of them are already in the transit area. So that's a strength in both scenarios that we're going to show you tonight. And then finally, this is that sort of emerging guidance that came through from the state last week, indicating that a portion of your overall selection of subdistricts can be coming from mixed-use districts, but only up to 25% of the total unit capacity that you are projecting. So in this case, we tried an example of having Milton Station, also known as Milton Village, as the one sub-district in which we would require commercial or require mixed use in order to pursue development in that sub-district. And so that would get you to 17%. So that would be in the clear. You are below that 25% maximum that can come from a mixed use district.
Zoe, can I jump in real quick?
Yeah.
Just to sort of explain a little bit more about kind of the choices here. The mixed use sub-district, the way that the new guidelines are kind of treating this is the mixed use sub-district is kind of now not a 3A district, sub-district, sort of, kind of. But the units still count towards it. So that has implications for geography that I think we'll get into a little bit later. But just to sort of explain the choice between Milton Village and East Milton Square, the thinking here is that Because if we choose to go with zoning for East Milton Square, what we're going to want to try to do, and this is why there are still parameters in red here for the max units per acre and the max building height, because what we're going to want to do is create a by right situation in Milton, in East Milton, that is less preferable than whatever special permit situation we come up with through the East Milton rezoning process, which will, that will incentivize mixed use, that will incentivize all of the things that we want to do in East Milton, in a way that we're not able to do in the Milton Station area. So in order to preserve that commercial component in Milton Village and Central Ave, we're going to, my advice here, and the board can certainly talk about it, would be to sort of, earmark that one for the required mixed use, and then, follow that procedure in East Milton Square where, yes, there's a by right in East Milton Square. We can't require mixed use, but we're going to create an incentive structure through the special permit zoning that pushes people towards mixed use. So that's just why you're seeing that, and we can have a further discussion later on.
Yeah, that's great framing. There's a lot of sort of ways to, fine tune this to try and, as Tim's saying, sort of encourage people to move towards a special permit pathway. The trick is deciding the strategy and where you really want to sort of have the by right zoning be the one that's requiring the thing that you want to sort of add into the mix. So I think there's a really strong sort of logic for, prioritizing that mixed use for the by right mixed use for Milton Station, and then having both sort of East Milton Square and Granite Ave be considered more in a sort of bonus structure or incentive structure. Any questions on this one before we jump into the other option that we have for you?
Why don't we go to option 2 and then we can open it up? That would be great.
Yeah, sounds good. Okay, so the second one, as I mentioned before, is pulling East Milton Square out of the mix and replacing it with sort of other sub-districts that can contribute in a similar way to kind of make the whole picture work. So what you see here is, in lieu of East Milton Square, we're adding in the 2 sub-districts along Randolph Avenue. You'll notice that in both of these scenarios, we have not included the Brush Hill Road sub-district, and that's because the sort of, given the parameters for sort of preferred density at that site, it was so low density that it was really dragging the whole thing down to a point that was sort of threatening the other sort of compliance metrics that you need to meet. So while it had a lot of sort of value as a standalone idea, it doesn't really contribute positively towards achieving compliance for the town as a whole. So with that note, sorry, jumped through that. Okay. So this is, you'll see here, we did start tinkering with the parameters for, this shares a lot of sort of DNA with the option 1. We did sort of do a little bit more tinkering here to bring the units per acre metric down on some of these. So you'll see, for instance, Granite Ave, Mattapan Station, and Milton Station. In this scenario, we ran them with 35. We can do something similar with option 1 if that's the preferred route, and sort of play with those parameters. For Randolph Ave and Access Road, we have that at 27, and Randolph Ave South at 25. I didn't really sort of cover this extensively in the prior one, but you all have clearly picked up on the fact that the transit area triplex has a maximum of 3 units per lot. So you cannot build more than that. If it's in a basement, you can't build more than that. If it's an attic, you can't build more than that. 3 is the cap. And right now we're using a 5,500 square foot minimum lot size. That's, again, something we can continue fine tuning. That's sort of baseline that we started with, and 3 stories total. And again, this one comes in compliant across the board. Generally speaking, pretty similar numbers to what we're seeing for option 1. This one has a slightly closer on the by a margin of about 100 units to the compliance target. So you really don't have much wiggle room there. So if you're going to change any of these other parameters, you would have to sort of consider expanding a district to add more units so that you could bring the density down elsewhere, for example. The density is at a similar point, 19.3 versus it's 19.2 for the other one. And then again, sort of have a healthy margin above your 50% minimum for the transit area metrics. And in this case, just for sort of expediency to kind of, be able to present a sort of a different way of thinking about it, we did not use the mixed use parameter for any of these. That's not to say that it couldn't be used, but in this version, we did not use it. So that's something that, again, if the preference is to move forward with a variant on option 2, we can introduce that as a sort of a variable. So with that, I'll jump to just the sort of summary here so you can see it all on one page in terms of the numbers. So you can see that there, across the board, these two scenarios are really quite close to one another in terms of the compliance profile that they give you. And so it's really a choice of, from a big picture planning rationale standpoint, what is the preference around this sort of trade-off of focusing on East Milton Square versus, letting that be a more customized zoning and pushing the development that's associated with the 3A district to instead be Randolph Ave, the two sort of sub-districts along Randolph Ave. So with that, I think before we kind of open up to sort of discussion about the trade-offs between these two, I think what I want to encourage you all to do is to as much as you can at this point, hold off a little bit from the sort of fine tuning of each of the individual districts and think more kind of big picture about which of these two pathways you feel is most aligned with your planning vision for the town. And know that there is still a lot of sort of more subtle manipulations that we can do to fine tune that once we have a direction from you all about which of these two feels more aligned with what you're looking for. And we know that in both cases, the transit area triplex will need quite a bit more work and the geography of it might change a little bit.
Zoe, can I jump in one more time?
Yep.
So one thing I want to just like quickly address, and maybe Zoe or Rahi can speak to it a little bit further. We've heard some comments about the size of the transit area triplex zone. And one thing that's important to understand about that is, and Zoe had mentioned, there's a number of different compliance targets that we kind of need to hit. What the triplex zone does is connect the Mattapan Station and the Milton Station subdistricts to create a series of subdistricts that represent 50% of the total land area of our zoning district, which is a requirement. It represents probably the smallest land area and the smallest number of parcels possible to achieve that goal and also feed into all of these other numbers that are on the screen. What happens when you increase the size of that subdistrict, just as if you were to increase the density of any other subdistrict, is that unit capacity number goes up. And this is something that we kind of struggled with a lot, and I'm glad that Zoe and Rahi were able to kind of thread the needle on this one, is that with some of the preferred dimensional parameters, especially minimum lot size, and some of the preferred kind of size and shape of these districts, from we've been using the term fairness, that is a restriction that we put on ourselves. And if the bigger that subdistrict becomes, the more that unit capacity number goes up. And so that becomes a sort of a decision point, even beyond all of these other decision points of what is the priority for creating a sort of geographically more diverse subdistrict there, or hewing as close to that minimum unit capacity number as possible, because that's ultimately what it is sort of the bigger that district becomes, the more parcels start to be folded in, the more that unit capacity number goes up. And then if you increase that minimum lot size number, and Zoe, did you have slides on this with the different?
Yeah, I can. I'm going to stop sharing for a moment, and I'll skip to those. We have a sort of a variety of other behind the scenes analysis that we've kind of been doing to get to this point. So I figured we pick and choose based on what was most useful.
I poked around in those earlier, and I think it's useful to show just sort of as you start to increase the minimum lot size, how many parcels start to get out of contention for contributing to unit capacity, which affects the overall density number. We talked early on about the concept of sort of, for overall density, your denominator is your land area and your numerator is your unit capacity number.
Jump back to these ones, actually. Do you want to start from the sort of bigger area?
Let's start from here. And you can just kind of walk through how you all kind of came to this. And I think it would be useful just to kind of see that.
Yeah, sure. So this is sort of, as I mentioned initially, we did start with the full half-mile radius around each of these stations, and looked at how that interacted with the model. And so one of the first things that we looked at was sort of the parcel size parameters. So right out of the gate, we considered a parcel that was 5,000 square feet or below to be, but one that was below 5,000 square feet as one that was not able to support a 3-unit development in a way that would work for Milton. And so that was a floor that we set of our own accord, just based on sort of urban design principles. And that's that has been proven throughout the Boston area as a really sort of reliable starting point for 3-unit development. And then the other sort of thing that we looked at is the really large and irregular lots that exist that would have to be zoned for a lot of units in order to be able to contribute positively towards compliance. So we essentially took that as a starting point of the areas where the parcels were, dominantly below 5,000, not going to be a good fit for this, and ones where the parcels were above the 25,000, also probably not going to be a good fit for this. So looking at that and then sort of trying to regularize it a little bit, this is sort of the blue underlay that you see here is a byproduct of that logic. Areas where the majority of the parcels could contribute positively. So that leaves us with this, and then we took out of that the 2 sort of denser station area opportunities that had larger parcel sizes and had a really direct relationship to transit. And that left us with this sort of what we characterized as sort of 7 sort of character sub-districts within that transit area. And this was really a mixture of things. It was partly about location, sort of distance from the stations, for instance, level of sort of the street network irregularity to get to the stations, thinking about how somebody would walk to the station or get to the station in other ways. Looking at the size of the parcels, there's kind of a pattern to each of these areas, the irregularity of the parcel shapes, and their orientation. And so what you can start to see here is subdistricts 1 through 5 sort of have a similar band of parcel sizes, but have different street configurations and parcel shapes. And then 6 and 7 have similar parcel sizes, but again have different street networks and sort of parcel shapes as a result of that. And so when we think about sort of urban design and character, the zoning rules would interact with these character areas differently. And so as we were getting further along, our sort of the 6 and 7 here would really need to hit, I think, Rocky, you read the numbers recently, was it 10 units per lot would be kind of a starting point for when they would begin to contribute positively. So just to sort of understand that if we add those, if you want to expand into those areas, in order for it to contribute positively towards compliance, you would need to be approaching something like 10 units on those parcels. Otherwise, we'd be adding area that would be sort of bringing down the compliance targets elsewhere while adding more units. So that's kind of the tension that Tim was pointing to earlier. So that's what sort of, based on that, that's why we've moved towards this this sort of reduced version that was really geared towards incremental sort of adaptive reuse or sort of renovation type development in this area, where you can imagine, for instance, my parents chose to add a garden level suite that I could live in while I was in grad school that made a huge impact for me. That's the kind of thing that this zoning would allow to happen. And this is something that, once Eric is in the weeds on this, he can advise much more sort of directly on this. The way that the market interacts with a 3-unit per lot development is very different from what you see for these larger multifamily types. So what you'd be more likely to see renovation and incremental development here than you would seeing like tear downs and rebuilds of triplexes or triple deckers like you imagine in Boston. It's really not, that kind of development doesn't pencil out in current economic climate. So with that reduced area, what we wanted to show you is, as you start to manipulate the square footage floor, right, the minimum lot size, it has an impact on how many parcels in this area can contribute towards compliance. So we start with the absolute floor of 5,000. 87% of the parcels in this subdistrict are eligible, are contributing. They could accommodate units. If you jump to the 5,500, which is where we have it set now, 76% of parcels are contributing. You get to 6,000, now only 68% of parcels are contributing. Get to 6,500 square feet minimum, you're getting to 63% of parcels. 7,000 square feet, 57% of parcels are contributing. And we stopped at here, 7,500, which was a number that I think came up early on in the public comment. At this point, only 49% of the parcels in this subdistrict are contributing, which starts to sort of, endanger the overall compliance. So at that point, you have to start expanding the district in order to get there, and you have to start allowing more than 3 units per lot in those areas in order for them to help.
Yeah, and Zoe, I think one more thing, and you can kind of start to see it a little bit on this map, is that there are, in the entirety of the half-mile radius, there are probably there's a good number of 7,500 square foot parcels. But in order to kind of lasso them into a contiguous district, you're going to be also grabbing a lot of smaller than 7,500 square foot parcels. So to kind of chase those numbers, you're kind of running a race against yourself in terms of that overall density number. Again, which has implications for the other subdistricts in order to make that up. So if you want to be able to modulate the density of the other districts and not have those exclusively serving, just to make up for the lack of density here, you really are limited in the size and shape of this subdistrict.
Yeah, it's a really helpful summary of it. I think it's really, that's why there's kind of it's critical to stay big picture for as long as you can, so that you're making those big picture decisions, because once you get into the weeds like this, they are so intertwined that you really need to hold on to those principles, right? So that you can make an informed decision about each of those trade-offs, because as Tim points out, the more you kind of essentially expand the area of this and reduce the density of this district, which is the feedback that we've gotten thus far has sort of been in that direction at this meeting. What that means is all of the other districts cannot come down in density, because right now they would be what would float your overall compliance. So there is a trade-off, as Tim's pointing out, between sort of optimizing for the feedback that we're getting for this district, and still controlling for the outside limits of what you're willing to do in the other sub-districts that will need to be dense enough to compensate for it.
And Zoe, that's 50 acres? Transit area triplex is the 50 acres?
That is the 50%. Let me actually jump back to 50%. A different slide. Okay. So the 50 acres, you're well in excess of the 50 acres, so that's not a constraint that you need to be concerned about. There's no version of compliance for you where you're not going to hit that. Or there's no version of the districts that you're considering where they won't hit that. The thing that, does interact with the transit area triplex is the percent of land in transit area and the percent of units in transit area. And so that right now you're comfortable in both of these scenarios, you're comfortably above that 50% minimum. I would say that, that this is the reason why you need something in this area, because without it, the only districts, I jump back to here, you can see like, for instance, the ones that are the sub-districts that are contributing to your transit area percentage are Granite Ave, Mattapan Station, Milton Station, and transit area triplex. All of the other sub-districts help in other ways, but they do not count towards your transit area requirements. And so that's the sort of the trade-off, right? Is that essentially this relatively small district does give you kind of puts you over the top to get past that 50% threshold.
Thank you. And Cheryl, I think I saw your hand up earlier. Did you have a question?
Yes, I wanted to ask, could you go back to one of your maps of this district while we're on this particular district?
You jump to that one helpful? I can go to the one that has the minimum lot size. Would that be more
sure?
helpful?
Yeah, the 7,500 minimum, just because that's been talked about quite a bit. So how easy or difficult is it for you to continue to manipulate the boundaries of this district to test? So if we said, okay, we wanted to try for a larger than 5,500 square foot minimum, and maybe actually one of the things that could be helpful in helping us decide this is sort of a test fit of what does 3-unit building on one of these, each of these lot sizes look like. Yeah. So on a 5,500 square feet with 50 feet of frontage, which a lot of these might have, their proportion of these sites is like narrower at the street, deeper, right? So, if you have a driveway and 3 parking spaces and we'd want to have the open space, I think 20% minimum is that's the default in the model. We probably want to raise that. But if we could test some of these, it would help us understand better, and I think help the public understand better what this really looks like on the ground. And then, so that's one thing. And then the next thing is just how quickly could you turn around some additional districts? So, for example, I'm just looking, if you, in the middle there, Valley Road, Rockwell Road, Oak Road, Gaskins Road, here. Maple Street, what does it look like if you include that? Or what does it look like if you include Morton Terrace over towards the right, Morton Road? Just to take into account, a lot of the comments that we've received about lot size, open space, character. So I've looked at this a little bit myself, understanding some of the 2 families that we have. We have less 3 families. We have a lot of 2 families actually in this district. And some of them are 3 stories, but not flat roof, more gambrel. Right. Some with, a gable roof with shed dormers, things like that. So I don't know how much 2.5 stories to 3 stories would impact this, but I think that would be something to look at as well.
Yeah, absolutely. So, the brief response is very quickly. We just during this call, Rocky ran about like 5 new scenarios as we were hearing, the feedback that we were getting. So we can iterate very quickly on these once we have a clear sense of what your priorities are, right? Like what we're trying to get to. And I think just from this call, I think we have a pretty clear sense of the things that you'd like to get to in this district. So I think and I'd like to hear from others to see if this is on point as well, but it seems like what we could do is, you tell us between option 1 and option 2, which one you think is your preferred route. recognizing that in both, the transit area triplex needs to change. If we hold those other ones constant and we keep them at the sort of maximum density that you're comfortable with in those, we can use all that flexibility to play around with, how far can we get with this transit area triplex to achieve the, the open space metric, the minimum lot size metric, and the number of stories metric, which I think are the three that I've heard most tonight. And I think there's a pretty decent chance that we have enough flexibility from the other ones to get to the sort of what's been described tonight for the transit area triplex. But what that means is kind of holding the other districts at where we have them right now for as a starting point.
Yeah. So we looked at some test fits that you folks had done for, speaking of the other parcels, the Granite Ave parcels, and I think we looked at maybe 700 units there. And what it looked like were buildings surrounded by parking lots with very little green space. And so I guess I would be really interested in some other test fit that would give us an idea that there could be usable open space. I mean, that Granite Ave location is rather isolated in terms of roadways. And so if you have families there, not having to deal with the roadways to have open space for children would be beneficial. And then can you bring up your slide of the East Milton, how many units there as compared to the Randolph Ave? Are they
Can I just say
units?
it is 10 o'clock, but I think this is really important, and I do want to talk about East Milton. So is the board okay with continuing for a little bit on this?
Yeah, maybe we should just be cognizant of the amount of time that we each speak.
Yep, definitely. So is that good with everybody to keep going?
Sure.
Okay.
My suggestion, we check in again at 10:30.
Yep, perfect.
Just to be disciplined.
Yep.
We'll go to 10:30 and we'll check again with the
That sounds
group.
great. All right, sorry, Cheryl, I didn't mean to interrupt because you were...
Yeah, just to give the feedback that Zoe asked for in terms of East Milton, are the two options, that what we're really looking at is a comparison between East Milton Square and the Randolph Ave parcels, right?
Yeah, that's right.
I wanted to understand how many units, so it's 423. Is it about that for the Randolph Ave parcels as well?
Yeah, so let's just, I'll hold that in my mind, the 423 there, and then I'm going to skip to the other here. So the combined Randolph Aves are coming in a little bit above that, right? So if 423 was the East Milton Square, if you kind of visually add this up, this would jump to around, 550, give or take.
You got there because you dialed down the density on Granite Ave, Mattapan, and Milton Station to 35 from 40.
Yes. Okay. Yeah, correct.
Can you go back to the East Milton then? And so that's at 4 stories. When you said earlier, marking that what's in red is something that you want to continue to look at, if you did adjust the height from 4 to 3 there, you would be obviously less unit count there. And so would you be needing to make up that difference in what's called the transit area triplex now?
Yeah, which I think will naturally happen from the things that you're describing because we'd be physically expanding the boundaries of it. So while we'd be reducing the density of that district, of the transit area triplex district, we would in fact be adding units to it because the district itself would be getting larger. So I think that balance could work if if you think about, overall the sort of the 3 parameters that are the highest priority are bring this number of stories down, bring this to 2.5, and bump this up as close as we can get to 7,500. If those are the 3 things that we're trying to achieve as sort of baseline adjustments here, I think that's, there's enough wiggle room and sort of complementary changes there that we could get to something that I think could be pretty close to what you have in mind.
So I just want to say that given what you just said, and what I've said before about how we're already planning to zone for an overlay for multifamily in East Milton Square, it makes sense to me to sort of count that in what we're doing here with MBTA communities. And given what Tim said earlier about making this to be less desirable than what the overlay would be, then it seems to make sense. This option seems to make the most sense to me.
So I did have a question, and maybe you can run this, Zoe, because this is this is an area that has mostly 1- and 2-story buildings, and we're trying to keep a New England village feel, in what we're doing, something really attractive, a sense of place, but keeping it in an appropriate scale. Would it be possible to consider, because what we're going to have to do is we're going to have to incentivize people to do if we want the special permit instead of by right, we're probably going to have to add another story onto the special permit to make that attractive. So I'm even thinking the by right should maybe even be 2 stories, and then we do a special permit with 3 stories, which is what the majority of East Milton has said that they want to do. If we did that, if we went to something like a 2-story, is it possible to consider doing a hybrid where maybe we do some of the units, reduce East Milton, keep East Milton in there, because I think there is value if we're going to be zoning that anyway, but do partial in either another district or one of the Randolph parcels, and actually do a little bit of a hybrid and try to do both, but do something that's more appropriate for both sites.
Yeah, so I think we could test that sort of scenario as in, if we brought East Milton Square down to 3, or then to sort of I would try and maybe put the floor at 2.5, because I think that's really kind of the that helps get you like a setback or a pitched roof, or I think probably in East Milton Square more likely a setback to have those upper stories sort of pull back from the street, right, which has a very similar effect. And we could, if we need an offset, like if we need to, add more area elsewhere, we can look at adding in one of the Randolph Road ones. I will just flag that what that will probably do is inch your total number of units up, but bring your density down closer to that 15 units per acre, which I think is, a reasonable approach, right? Given the priorities that I'm hearing around kind of character and urban design, that that's a trade-off, right? Is like you can get closer to those urban design goals if you are allowing a slightly lower density over a larger area, which sort of gives you more units. So I think in brief, East Milton Square, we can definitely bring that 4 down. There is a certain kind of you'll be, I'm sure, exploring this through your custom zoning for East Milton Square, but there are market thresholds where kind of if you have, when you start to get to like 2 stories or below, like very little pencils out to build in the current market conditions. So I would just caution you against going too low there, because you might get no response to it. So that's kind of that's in a sense it's outside of the considerations of the 3A compliance. But it is something to think about as you think about how this interacts with the zoning you end up with in East Milton Square as your new kind of base zoning or special permit pathway there.
That's great. Okay. Anyone else?
Can I ask a question?
Yes.
Can you touch a little bit on why you omitted the Brush Hill Road district? I'm not understanding that.
Sure. So Brush Hill Road, let me jump back to the aerial of it. So we did some urban design test fits on this site, similar to what we did for Granite Ave, using setbacks and sort of development controls that we felt would be consistent with the pattern that exists here already and the norms of kind of setbacks and amount of open space, recognizing that there's sort of a certain set of norms that in this context where it is further from transit, there are fewer amenities nearby, it is a less walkable area that we want to be mindful of. So we ran those test fits on this and used that as a way to generate a reasonable units per acre cap that we could use as a proxy for that sort of set of urban design parameters. And after putting that into the model, the result was so low in density that, and because this is actually quite a comparatively a large area that would be zoned in that way, it really brought the numbers for the entire collection of sub-districts down. And both our team and Tim and Josh tested so many different ways to kind of keep it in there. And in all of those versions, it really brought the whole the whole district concept down below the density metric. So there wasn't any combination of this and other sub-districts that we could come up with that hit that 15 units per acre minimum without opening this area up to much denser development that we felt was not reasonable given its sort of level of access and infrastructure.
Did you do it as all three, or would it be possible just to take that southernmost portion and run your adjust your parameters a little bit and run your model just on that one?
So there's a little bit of a wrinkle, which is that this, can you see my cursor on here as I'm going? Okay. So this sort of slightly oddly shaped skinny parcel is actually in the parcel data is tied to this southernmost larger parcel. So those two cannot be separated because the model is based on the parcel data. So you can't subdivide parcels. A parcel is either included or it's not included.
I'm sorry, in the model or in reality? I mean, I get the model won't let you do it, but in reality, could somebody just build that bottom and not touch that top? I don't see why not.
Yes, they could, but the zoning, the 3A districts, the zoning district has to include all of a parcel or none of a parcel. So it's not to say that somebody can respond to it however they choose, but the zoning itself has to be full parcels.
What about the middle one? I'm just trying to find a way to take advantage of those existing units that are already there.
Yeah, so this one is in my recollection, and maybe Rahi, if you can sort of double check this in parallel, but my recollection is that the two that I had spoken about previously, this skinny one and the southernmost one, are tied together. Oops, sorry. Hold on.
It's okay.
The middle one is, as I understand it, Tim, is owned by the same person, but the parcels themselves are distinct. They are recorded separately. And so they can be separated out in our modeling work.
They can be?
Yeah.
Okay.
So we could look at a reduced version of this that is, just the smallest top version and the middle one, or just the middle one. But again, it would have a similar effect. It would drag down the numbers no matter what version of it we do. If it is a smaller sub-district, it will drag the numbers down less, but it will still drag the numbers down. So you'll have to compensate for it elsewhere.
So just to that point, I feel like that's a defect in the model. And then I don't think that we should, it's not proper planning to use defects in models. So maybe the model
what's the defect that you're referring to? The fact that the parcels can't be separated?
Correct, yeah.
In a sense, it doesn't, I hear what you're saying. And the outcome for you doesn't change based on that defect, because even if you included one of these parcels, it would still drag down your numbers. So we can come up with a smaller sub-district here, right? It's just that, it'll have a similar effect. The order of magnitude will come down a little bit, but it's, every version of this district is a low density district. It is way below the 15 units per acre minimum. And so it will drag down the overall numbers, even if the district itself is smaller.
And I think the principle here is that we're already contending with a low density district that we have to have in the transit area triplex. And so, if if we didn't have to deal with that, we'd be able to perhaps lower the densities in some of the other districts. But, it's sort of just a further handicap that, will kind of compel us to have higher densities on Granite Ave, at Milton Station, at Mattapan Station than maybe we want. But it's certainly, so that, that one middle parcel is greater than 5 acres. It's its own separate parcel. It could certainly, we could certainly test it. But I think Zoe's right about the effect.
So could you test it with different parameters, like less open space or not townhouse style architecture and something a little different to try to get it up?
Yes. And I guess I would kind of zoom back out to the sort of the bigger planning question, which is this the part of your town where you think significant higher density development is best placed?
Yeah, personally, yes. I'd rather see it there than on Randolph Ave, but that's just me. If it works.
Personally, neither one of these options are really my vision for the planning of Milton. And so I'm personally not happy with either vision. And I'm still struggling, and I know everyone's probably tired of me saying this, I'm still struggling with law versus guidelines. I feel like we should take baby steps in this, and I know you're liking to see the bigger vision, but it's easier for people to focus on a smaller district. So as Cheryl said at the beginning, maybe it would be helpful to kind of focus on one area in which maybe we all have somewhat of an agreement for. We know that development is going to happen in, on Adams Street and extra space storage and into Central Ave. So I would like to see a build-out analysis there first, and then see where that gets
those streets you're mentioning. Those are those in the transit area triplex, or those are on the East Milton Square?
No, that's streets, in the Milton
Village,
Station.
Milton Station.
Milton Station. Okay, got it. Sorry.
And again, as I said, I'm struggling with guidelines versus law. So 5 acres minimum is in the guidelines. So I'm comfortable if we have areas that are less than 5 acres. And I know Tim could push back on that, but I want to make sure that our commercial districts stay commercial. We don't want to put more unnecessary housing in our commercial districts. I own a business in town, and it's very, very difficult to operate a business in this town outside a commercial district. It's virtually impossible to do. So I want to keep as much commercial business in those districts.
Yeah, I think that's we can certainly, focusing on this, it seems like there's a lot of, consensus around this district, and that there's maybe a couple others that have a similar level of support, and that I think what we see in our work in current market conditions is that mixed use, where there is denser residential close to or even better sort of intermixed with commercial, that is the kind of environment that is most supportive of higher business sales, higher foot traffic, more activity. And so there's a certain symbiotic relationship between the two, recognizing that, as you say, the protection of the commercial is critical to that, right? Because residential will outprice it when commercial is not required. So I think this is a great place to be prioritizing for mixed use for exactly that reason. It's a way to have the residential drive better outcomes for the businesses themselves.
So that's great.
Can I just chime in here quickly? To what Maggie's comment there. And I'm just thinking about extra space storage and 88 Wharf, which are those two properties, large properties on the right side there. And then on the other side at Mattapan Station, Unquity House. I think Unquity House is currently 6 stories. And on the other side of extra space storage, the Baker Chocolate Building, I believe, might be 6 stories as well. So I was wondering if we make, instead of making these districts the same if this one had a higher height allowance, and the same for where extra space storage and 88 Wharf. I can't remember if 88 is 6 stories. It might be 5, but it's 5 or 6. And it seems to me that those are not so much not so much up against single-family residential as, say, the other parts of this district are. Maybe that's not a blanket 4 stories and same parameters across the whole district.
The only issue with that is that that's where we've done overlay zoning, and there's no reason for, with the overlay zone parameters. I think you're going into Adams Street properties, which are, there are,
I think this is where they were going to have the commercial be a requirement. That's, I agree about the commercial being a requirement here.
But I think that was part of particularly when we were doing the overlay zoning in the Milton Village, that was a concern. The height was a big part of that, and I just wouldn't want to eliminate.
Yeah, 88 Wharf is already 6 stories, I think.
Right, but that's set down low. That's set down in a much lower.
So that's something that I guess I'd have to look at the specifics of the law to understand how this would interact. But as I mentioned sort of at the outset, right now we're talking in terms of stories. You can eventually add, a building height measurement as well as the stories, which controls the interaction of the overall physical bulk of the building versus how it's relating to its site. So you can allow for, say, 3 stories of development with a building height that assumes, some portion of that first story is going to be below grade, is going to be a garden level apartment, for instance. So to give my parents' house as an example, it's a 2-story mansard roof development, and the back, the sort of lot line, the topography drops down in the back. They have a garden level apartment in the back. The presentation to the street is the same as every other house on the street, but they have essentially another unit tucked in behind. So there's some subtlety there that can control for the relationship of stories and actual physical bulk on the site.
Yeah, I was just really suggesting trying to make the zoning here match what's on the ground.
Yeah, what's built already.
Already in these kind of sub-district within a sub-district is what I was thinking. So,
well, the only other thing too is these are also historic mill buildings. There's a lot of historic properties down there. One of the things that we also looked at with the Milton Village was not incentivizing demolition. And I think when you get to this level of height, there's definitely an incentive for demolition and not reuse of buildings. So I think where we are on the height of this, I would definitely reconsider that, or not change what we are. I think it's good where we are right now.
Yeah, I have a comment and a question for Zoe. My comment is that I just Brush Hill Road, Randolph Ave don't seem consistent with what the whole intent is, to develop areas like that. It's a departure, it's a strategy, really, that's what it is. And it just doesn't make good sense to me. I'm still an advocate for zoning what's right for Milton, and I recognize that, we have this number that's hanging over us. Yeah. And I think you're hearing from residents that are really upset of how their neighborhoods are going to be changed. When the folks in East Milton start considering how East Milton's going to be changed by the numbers that are in these models, it's going to be, they're just not even paying attention to it right now, but they're going to hear about it. So Zoe, my question is, if we had a reclassification to a 10% requirement, how many of the issues that we're all speaking of tonight would be easily resolvable?
You mean as in having the state reclassify whether you are a rapid transit community?
Correct.
I don't think it's worth entertaining that because I don't think it's going to happen.
That wasn't my question, though. My question was, if you were building...
I understand your question, but as a consultant trying to advise you on how to to move through this process, I don't think it's worth your time to consider that.
And Zoe, I
it's a
appreciate
separate
that. I appreciate that, but I'm representing the residents of the town of Milton, and many of the residents of the town of Milton have a desire for that. So that's the basis for my question. I appreciate your advice, but of the concerns that we have here, and we're juggling a lot of different concerns, would many of these go away if we had a 10% classification?
Sean, I think
can't speak to that because I haven't looked at it.
Yeah, that would take a little bit more analysis
Could you look at
than
it
we
for
can
next
do.
time?
I think
I'm not comfortable doing that.
Yeah, it's not, that's a whole different, two different things, I think. All right, so I think, I think Granite Ave, I think there's consensus on that, the Milton
I
Station.
push back is I only have
Yeah.
consensus on 2 Granite Ave.
2 Granite Ave, that's what
Yeah, I don't have all Granite Ave.
Sorry, 2
Really?
Granite Ave is what, well.
Yeah.
Interesting.
Two
Not including the
Granite Ave
DPW yard?
we wouldn't be able to do solely 2 Granite Ave. It doesn't meet the threshold for the size of a sub-district.
Which I understand that, and as I said earlier, I am questioning the 5-acre minimum.
How big is 2 Granite Ave, Tim? 4 acres? Or 3?
It's less than 4, more than 2.
I think our goal is to find out, if we are going to be compliant with what we're being told with the information, that we make this the best possible that we can. And I think there is consensus, but I think there's work to be done with 2 Granite and with the triplex area. And
So is the goal to try to give these guys something to look at?
yes,
in the next
we need to
3
give our
minutes?
consultants guidance.
That's okay, I get it.
Yeah.
So
does
would
that,
you
is
look
that,
at the
was
whole
that
Granite Ave
helpful? I
transit
think where we
area?
are-
Would you?
I don't believe
On
700 units on Granite Ave is.
No, but that's what they would look at. You know, what can we do less than? I don't believe 700 is good either. But maybe
No,
we look
and
at
it's-
300.
And it's not.
300 is not right either.
Okay.
We're down to 554 in the Granite Ave district.
Which spread out is actually can be.
getting warmer.
As a comparison,
It's getting
Jim,
warmer.
As a comparison, North Quincy is 601.
North Quincy T Station,
Yeah.
the target
But
underneath.
it's on a much smaller acreage.
I don't want to be North Quincy T Station.
No, but it's on a smaller, it's on a, you have to compare the acreage and.
What is
So
the,
they're already down. He said he's already down to 500 something.
Yeah.
you're saying the North Quincy acreage is smaller than what we're talking about here?
Yes,
The American Legion Hall.
This is
and
an
the DPW
uncommonly
yard.
large parcel
yeah.
for a community that's as built out as yours.
Can I jump in for a minute on this question? I think if we could give them direction on the district, then they can do the tests that I think
Right.
are going to be helpful to understand these numbers. And I really think that it's beneficial to get to that level of testing for decision making, which we know we need to get to. So, even though I think there's things that everybody might still be concerned about, we need to give these folks some direction.
Right.
And I'm comfortable that they understand from hearing from us and hearing from residents earlier, the goals that what we're trying to achieve, and it's time to get them back to the boards and working on it so they can come back to us with some updated compliance models. And so I don't know if we need to have make a motion to take a vote on it, but I'd be willing to make one if that's what we need to do.
A motion to vote option 1 or option 2? Or to split it up and have them look at different.
Do the hybrid
Area.
of the,
Yeah, okay.
I don't know that it has to be, exactly these options because they've heard what we're interested in, but just, I think it's more whether we want to keep East Milton Square in and keep out Brush Hill Road and take out Randolph Ave, or include 1 Randolph Ave and see what those numbers do. But I think the more we keep testing these districts in and out, the less time we have to see how these numbers really look on the ground.
Right.
Because I really think that we need to see how the numbers work on the ground. What's the difference now, on Granite Ave to be 545 instead of 700 and some that we looked at before. What does it look like I said before, on a 5,000 square foot or 5,500 square foot lot of 6,000, 7,500, et cetera? To me, that's going to help inform so much more than just looking at spreadsheets. I really want to see us get to that very soon. And that's why I'd like to say, well, this is a good place to start taking it to that level. Doesn't mean this is all locked in yet. It's getting us to the next analytical level that we need.
Okay, so let's make some decisions. I would support keeping East Milton Square in, and I would take Brush Hill out.
And put
I
it
would
down to
support
2.5
that.
to 3 stories on East Milton.
Yeah, I think one thing that hopefully you all can maybe decide on and give some clear direction, and which I think is important, is, to Meredith's point, getting East Milton to a level where we can offer a credible incentive via the special permit overlay. And I think the trade-off there, because we're going to lose on some unit capacity, the makeup becomes in the transit area triplex. And then how do you expand the transit area triplex to make up those units? I think in the overall density, we've got a little bit of wiggle room. So hopefully it's just a matter of making up that unit capacity number. So I think sort of, one potential task is to get East Milton to a level that we're comfortable at, maybe a 2 or 2.5 max building height, and then get the transit area triplex to a level where, it's providing the number of units that we need to maintain a unit capacity number.
Well, I'd support 2.5 for East Milton.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so that with any incentive, it would not, 4 stories is very tall in East Milton.
Oh, yeah, and that's not even, and then
we
we'd
don't-
have to
so
do a
would we-
bonus.
So you'd have to do an incentive,
Yeah.
so if it's
So
2.5.
Then we can have room to do an incentive for special permit.
And you think you would want to go up to 4 with
No.
via a special permit?
No, maybe 3 with a.
Well, you all just approved a 4-story building over there,
Special
so
permit.
it's not unheard of.
All right. Yeah, I think that's good to
Yeah, I
move
think,
ahead.
if you said 3, that's the thing, we had a step back, that could come in design guidelines later. You required a step back at that top floor, which is, what happened on 440 Granite Ave.
Yeah, and that's 4 is too tall.
But to Zoe's point, you're probably not going to get a lot of development at 3, I think.
Yeah,
I mean,
that's
It
okay.
might not be economically feasible at 3. At 4, it would be.
I think if it's mixed use with, you look at the Elliott Physical Therapy, that's a 2-story with apartments above and first floor commercial.
True.
It exists.
And just, Jim, 2 Granite is 4.11 acres. So at 15 units per acre, you could do 62 units. At 20 units per acre, you could do 82. And at 40 units per acre, you could do 164.
Yeah, the only problem, I don't have a problem with that. The only problem is that
Then we need more districts.
the 5 acres versus the 4.1, do we push it? I know
Yeah.
Brookline's submitting their plan with 41 acres instead of 50.
Yeah.
So someone's pushing it somewhere.
Yeah. And my other question is it, I kind of heard that possibly they're looking to extend the December 31st deadline. I was talking to someone in another town, and that's what they said. That's what they heard.
I haven't heard that, but obviously the state is responding to the environment, and comes out with updated guidance occasionally. So if there's a deadline extension, we'll of course be sure to let you know. But I wouldn't count on it because the downside is considerable if you don't take the deadline seriously.
Great. All right, so our next meeting is on the 14th.
Have we
Meredith,
answered-
do we have clear direction?
What are we looking at? What are we
Oh, no,
looking
sorry.
at?
Yeah.
It is at 10:30, but do you want to check in?
I think, can we, I think what Cheryl said earlier is, let's just quickly answer any questions that we have to, so Zoe can.
Okay. Great.
So I think I have what I need to move forward. The only sort of, I think, gray area that we've left is if in order to reach these sort of urban design parameters, I'll say, for East Milton Square and for the transit area triplex, if if that requires adding back in Randolph, one of the Randolph districts. Do you have a preference as to which one we add back in? And do you have a preference as to whether we incorporate Randolph Ave or expand the transit area triplex more?
I was kind of wondering if we could, we have some parcels on just outside the transit triplex that we created zoning for a few years ago and no one's taken advantage of. And it's on the corner of Brook Road and Blue Hills Parkway and Laurel, and it's like a service station, a food mart, a burnt down Knights of Columbus. So I'm kind of wondering if we could look at that and provide an opportunity for those residents to take advantage of this. And it would be, slightly outside of the half mile. But
Maggie, there's also some 3 families next to that, or at least one.
It's actually a 4.
Isn't that in the half mile? I thought that was in the half mile.
I think it is in the half
here?
mile.
Yeah,
Yes.
it's down there somewhere. Exactly.
Yeah, at the corner of Brook Road and Thatcher Street.
Yeah, so let me jump down to
That's in
here.
it.
That's a good call.
Yeah.
So
That's a good call.
we had pulled that out. Let me just make sure I'm giving you full information here of why we did that. So in this area, there are quite a few parcels that are below 5,000. So that was our initial reason for pulling back from that area. But as you can see, there are parcels here that would still be viable. It would result in a lower density because those parcels would, a significant number of parcels would be excluded. But I think given the overall role that it's playing, I think that that's probably fine now that we have a clearer sense of how this is relating to all the other sub-districts. So we can look at that.
Can we have within our district, like sub-districts that do have smaller lot sizes? Why do they all have to be the same?
Yes, you can. Yeah. You can. You can create within, as long as they're all contiguously, they're all touching one another, to count towards that 50% contiguous area. You can subdivide within it to give different dimensional parameters, zoning parameters for different sort of sub areas. So you can certainly, if you think that it makes sense to allow development on smaller lot sizes in this area, we can alter that parameter.
Can you go back to the district as you calling the triplex now, just to see where this falls related to that?
So this is, so it would be down here. So in order to kind of make it contiguous, what we'd be looking at is sort of pulling this area along, looks like Briarfield Road, Hawthorne Road, Fairfax, and Brandon would be sort of the way to connect to this.
Could it actually connect on the other side of the parkway instead?
Yeah, as long as there's parcels that span the street, yes. I will just also note that this area has even smaller parcels, so it is a little bit more challenging.
You'd want to probably hug the east side of the parkway to get down there.
Yeah, you could, for instance, have on either side of the parkway, you could just pull the parcels that are facing on the parkway and then use that to connect here, for instance.
It may not be bad to include.
Computer library.
No, I was thinking the school and the church, and only because over time, schools and churches, may change use. A school affiliated with the church, it may not be. It may not be in the near future, but, they are large land parcels there.
Yeah, and the old temple up on Blue Hill Ave, could do, if you are pushing 5 acres, you could do that, a 5-acre parcel up there.
I thought we couldn't do schools and churches.
If it is publicly owned land, you cannot count it towards this, which is basically saying that that land is currently out of the private market. It cannot be developed as anything but what it is currently, unless a public sector entity releases it from that state. So that's I think that's probably the parameter, the restriction that you're thinking of, which can apply to like school sites if they are a public school site.
Yeah, the one I'm referring to is a private school.
Yeah,
but
so it would not be
affiliated with the
subject to
church.
that.
Yeah.
Which one? Decatur Library?
St. Mary's.
No, the St. Mary's.
Or St. Mary's of the Hills? All right.
Again, I'm not suggesting that these are things that are going to happen anytime soon, but I just am curious what would happen in terms of the compliance model if those were included.
That seems like a long way to stretch. I mean, you see where the church is. St. Mary's is even further away.
Unless it's 5 acres.
Not the church, the school.
I'm assuming this is a church based on its
Right.
form.
But across the street is a school.
Oh, I thought you mentioned the church.
Yeah, we said church and school.
So how about we do this? It sounds like there's this area here seems like, if we're going to expand the transit area triplex district, this is an area that makes sense, and we could give it custom parameters. And that is there some level of consensus that connecting to it via Blue Hills Parkway, just the parcels on either side, is a reasonable starting point? And then, once we get there, we can, fine tune individual parcels. But like from a broad perspective, does that sound about right?
I think so. I think we'd like to see that Knights of Columbus area that be developed.
I want to understand what was the intention with St. Mary's?
Well, it depends how many units we need to add to this area. It's just, I'm not sure what that does in the model and how the minimum lot size impacts that. It's just a large parcel in that area, Sean, that's all.
Yeah, I get it.
We were trying to connect
I'd like
that
to accomplish it without it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
My preference.
Yeah, so let's come back to you with it, and you can see it with the numbers there, and that's like kind of those kinds of like individual parcel level decisions, I think, are probably best done once we have the sort of updated numbers to decide it with. But I think I think you're talking through something that's valuable to consider. Might just be hard to make a decision without more information.
Thank you.
I think it would be, my preference would be to really look at this district, as I think others have said, rather than the Randolph Ave, an isolated parcel. Because then I really think the transit area and East Milton Square and Granite Ave all make sense for their own reasons.
That's in a lot of the communities we've been working with, some version of that is where people have landed, because by focusing multifamily housing in areas that already have some level of amenities and infrastructure, you help to reinforce those amenities and infrastructure for the whole town. So it has this sort of co-benefit, recognizing, of course, that this is something that's new for Milton in a lot of places and is scary for that reason, that concentrating in areas where it could benefit you the most in terms of reinforcing the assets and infrastructure and amenities that you care about is a really valid and proven approach that a lot of communities are taking across the board, different levels of density, different characters.
And just, am I correct in understanding that if a development needs new like pipes and infrastructure, that the town is not responsible for paying that? That's on the developer?
And I don't know the details of your parameter, like your local regulations enough to like 100% confirm, but yes, generally speaking, that is on the developer. That is a cost that is associated with their development, their proposal, their financial pro forma. It's something they have to build into their costs.
Can I ask you, how quickly do you think you could turn a new set of compliance models around? And then secondly, how long it would take to do that other more build out analysis, at least sample parcels? I
think that we can turn around an updated sort of set of districts with what we just talked about, sort of adjusting the parameters, the maps, et cetera, within a week. I think that for the urban design test fitting, I'd have to double check with our urban designers, but I expect that might be a little bit closer to a 2-week time frame, something along those lines, to get them to be able to dig into those. They're pretty busy right now on a couple of projects.
So I was wondering, Meredith, if we should consider adding a meeting, if we think.
I was going to ask the board the same thing. I was just thinking that maybe just for this discussion.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's really been nice to have a good chunk of time for this tonight.
Yeah.
And so if we could have a meeting that's dedicated to it. I think that would be really beneficial.
I do too. So we would be looking at
31st?
I was thinking, they need 2 weeks, right? So you're going to
give you
I was thinking the weekend
One
after.
week for the, okay.
A week after Labor Day, like that first,
The 7th?
the 7th.
Yeah. let me
7th
just-
works
hang
for
on.
me, if it works for these folks.
7th works for me. That would be good.
Yeah, it
Does it work
looks
for
like
you,
that-
Zoe?
Yeah, that's available. I think, Rahi, correct me if I'm wrong, you're out that day, but I think we have enough time between now and then for you to run through these.
Yep, that's right.
Okay, so you'll, the 7th is what we're looking at?
Yep.
And it would be the same time, 7 to 10 or so?
I hope
Yeah,
not.
and hopefully it wouldn't take us that long. If this is the
Well,
only,
yeah,
the only.
I'll block
thing-
it off. We'll
Yeah.
you know, it'll take the time it takes, but I appreciate your mindfulness of it, of course.
And I just wanted to confirm, in the scope of our contract with you, are you doing the build-out analysis for us as well?
So we can do, we don't have economic analysis in-house. So that would be something that you should look to RKG for. But we do urban design, what we call test fitting, which is I think what you're describing, which is essentially visualizing, using these parameters, using the sites, a typical site. Usually if we're looking at it across an entire district, we won't do a custom test for every single parcel, but we're sort of use a typical parcel and we can show you what's reasonable to expect on that, given sort of the standards that are used for different uses and different building types in terms of like construction norms, and look at it with the zoning parameters that you have in mind and see how they interact. And so we can do like a 2D, 3D visualizations of that for you.
That's great. Yeah.
And how many back and forths do we get? Like how many shots at this do we get? Is it unlimited until our time runs out, or?
Well, we have nobody likes to talk about money. We have a fee. So you have us for whatever you need us for the most, up to that limit.
So what does that mean? I'm sorry.
So
is that
we're working on getting Zoe, I didn't even open up the document. I assume it's the same, a little less than $20,000.
Yeah, it's the same number.
Yeah, which we'll be paying out of some of the grant money that we've gotten from the state. Just to kind of, the state of play on those grants. We got a $50,000 grant last year, another $30,000 grant this year. 30,000 of that is going to RKG for their fiscal impact analysis. Another 20,000 of that is going to UTIL to kind of continue this work. So there is still, a bit of a pot of money if, I'm not concerned about the money running out. I'm actually more concerned about the time running out. So, we're going to be executing a contract with UTIL to continue this work, hopefully next week. And then, if we need to add more fee to that, we've got the availability to do that.
Great.
All right.
Perfect.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you so much. We really appreciate your time tonight.
Likewise. Thanks for sticking with it with us, and now we have a good homework to take back.
Thank you, Zoe.
Great. All right. Okay, so that I believe completes all the work that we need to get done tonight. And Tim just gave it a little budget update. So I think if there's not anything else, we are ready to have a motion to adjourn.
Motion to adjourn.
Second?
All right. All in favor? Well, roll call.
Yes,
Maggie?
yes.
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 Cheryl?
Yes.
And myself, yes.
Sweet.
Good night. Thank
Good
you.
night, everyone.
Thank you.
Night.